anybody else, your friends who want to see the class, can see it streamed live. And we're also recording it, so it'll be available for you on the e-commons. So you can look back at a previous class and something you might have missed in taking your notes or something that you want to take a look at again will be available for you there. Okay? And finally, under administration, there's 3 new essays that I dug up on natural law in its relationship to the Constitution, which is sort of the key theme that we're going to be dealing with in this class. And we've put them up on e-commons that are there now as of today. In resources, under resources. Under week 2. And in fact, we'll have them inserted into the syllabus so that they're links that you can pop onto after today. Okay, but if anybody wants to rush right home and look at them today after the session, they'll be there on the e-commons. But as of tomorrow, they'll be up into the syllabus. Okay, now on Tuesday in the first class, I focused a lot upon the type of challenges that you are going to be facing, both now and in the remainder of your lives. There's still some seats right here. And I touched on a number of the kind of short-term kind of logistical challenges, some of the more middle-level tactical challenges, and the longer-term strategic challenges that you're going to be facing. For example, under the logistical challenges, we were pointing out that you're confronted by right now, logistically, the most conservative Congress that we've had since 1929 under Herbert Hoover, immediately before the collapse of the economy and the beginning of all the things that led up to World War II. And logistically, or tactically rather, I'm pointing out that we're temporarily faced with a whole rash of activities going on in the Middle East right now with regard to terrorist attacks, and a constant barrage of the potential threat of terrorist attacks here at home, and you're being inundated with kind of propaganda every night on the news about the valor of our troops and the sanctity of the operation that they're engaged in the Middle East. So it's kind of a peculiar tactical challenge of facing this during this particular immediate period. But strategically, I pointed out that we have these longer range challenges for you that are made up of the onset of global climate change that actually portend some serious major problems of the potential inundation of up to almost 10 miles of the seacoasts throughout the entire planet during the course of your life, and the dislocation of almost 45 to 50% of the entire population of the world having to move inland to be generating serious problems with the other people who live there now, and also the depletion of the fresh water, the potable water on the planet with the melting of the glaciers and the polar ice caps, and the alteration of the salination levels of the sea. Now, these are major long-term strategic challenges that you're going to be confronted by, as well as the rise of a major national security state here in the West, which is going to be mobilizing first under the rationale of anti-terrorism, but then to try to cope with these major dislocations and disruptions that are going to be generated by the global climate change. And also they're preparing to confront China as it ascends into the position of the dominant economic power in the world, and having the most dominant conventional military power in the world. That you're going to be confronted by this challenge during the course of your life on a strategic level. But today, what I want to do is I want to focus on the positive resources that you have available for you. One of which is a partnership with the baby boomer generation the idealist generation of the 21st century. But I want to review a number of these resources that we have to work with here over the period of the next 45, 50 years. But what I want to do is each class session, I want to make certain to share with you at least one story of specific information that you otherwise are not going to have access to, which will dramatize for you the degree to which the reality that is portrayed to you by the major news media every day, by both political parties, and by virtually all of the official sources, even in the academy. I want to make sure to communicate at least one detailed story to you, which will make it clear to you that things are not what they seem, so that you can realize that you have to mobilize to deal with things the way they really are in the world, as distinct from this fiction that is portrayed to you. So I want to start today with just one, and then we'll move to the more positive resources that we have at our disposal to deal with these kind of things. But let me just tell you briefly that when we filed the major federal civil lawsuit that began the Iran Contra Scandal, that broke into the public in 1986. We filed this case on May 30th of 1986 in the United States District Court for the Southern District of Florida down in Miami. We filed it at 4:30 in the afternoon toward the end of business day at 5 o'clock on a Friday on May 30th of 1986. On Monday morning, now we had in the course of filing this lawsuit, you have to file copies of the civil complaint. You have to file copies with all of the defendants, so that they will have a copy of it, and they're on notice as to what they're being charged with before you actually present it to the court. And we were serving a fellow named Ronald Joseph Martin. Ronald Joseph Martin was the owner of the Tamiami gun shop down in Miami that were actually supplying the false end user certificates to the military equipment that was being smuggled out of the Fort Lauderdale Hollywood Airport down in Florida, down into Ilopango, down in El Salvador, the jointly administered U.S. and Salvadorian military base, where they were flying all the weapons into, with the direct cooperation of the United States Air Force, and then flown down into Costa Rica and distributed to the Contras, who had already been publicly condemned by the International Court of Justice as international terrorists for mining the public harbors in Nicaragua to threaten to blow up ships in international commerce, which is a violation of international law. And during the surveillance that we had up of Ronald Joseph Martin's home, in order to serve him personally with a subpoena, our investigators actually monitored and watched a meeting take place where several major known international terrorists actually were coming to the home of Ronald Joseph Martin, not the least of which was Luis Posada Correa, who was guilty of blowing up a civilian Cuban airliner back in 1976 and killing the 73 members of the international fencing team for the Cuban people, and in blowing up several hotels and killing people down in Cuba. And he was one of the people coming to this particular meeting. And major drug smugglers, confirmed drug smugglers, Morales and some others, and of course also Jeb Bush, who happened to be in attendance at that particular meeting with all of these people, therefore suggesting that Jeb Bush probably might not be the best person to select for anti-terrorism policies for the country. But we served the subpoenas on them in the copies of the complaint, and then we filed our complaint on Friday afternoon at 4:30. The following Monday morning, at 10 o'clock, I receive a call in my office in Washington, D.C., at the base of Capitol Hill, and it's Chief Judge James Lawrence King, who is the chief federal judge in Miami, appointed by Richard Nixon at the direct recommendation of Bibi Rebozo, who is a major professional criminal and an associate of the mafia, who is one of the best friends of Richard Nixon, who actually recommended the appointment of this man, who happened to be a member of the board of directors of Meyer Lansky's National Bank of Miami, which is one of the major mob banks in the country, where they launder the major drug money coming up out of Cuba under Batista, back before '59. And I get the call from James Lawrence King, and he said to me, Mr. Sheehan, this is Judge James Lawrence King, the chief federal judge here in Miami. I have in front of me here your complaint, which you filed last Friday afternoon at 4:30, and I'm going to be entering an order of summary judgment against this complaint if you're not personally in front of my court by 2 o'clock this afternoon. So I dash off back in my office, and I get on a suit, and I rush down, and I take a cab over to the National Airport and fly down to Miami and get a cab and rush over to the courtroom. And I go up into the courtroom, and here is Judge King sitting on the bench, fully robed, with his watch, watching the clock. And arrayed out in front of him are 26 attorneys that are already there on board in the courtroom with Judge King. And Judge King says, Mr. Sheehan, I'm glad to see that you made it on time, but I've asked you to come here because I'd like to introduce you to the lawyers that are going to be representing the defendants in the lawsuit that you have filed. And here, who's going to be chief counsel for the defendants is Mr. Anthony Lapham. He is going to be representing Adolfo Calero, whom you've represented in your complaint to be the head of the FDN Contras. The head of the LaGuardia in Nicaragua. He said, so that's Mr. Anthony Lapham. And I said to myself, Anthony Lapham, why is it I recognize this guy's name? And then I realized that he was chief counsel for the Central Intelligence Agency under George H.W. Bush, when he was the director of the CIA from 1975 to 1977 under Gerald Ford. So you got the chief counsel for the CIA representing now the head of the FDN Contras, who are being accused of massive drug smuggling, arms smuggling, political assassinations, etc. And then Judge King says, and also now representing Mr. Ronald Joseph Martin, who is the owner of the Tamiami gun shop here in Miami that you are accusing of providing the false end user certificates. He's going to be represented by Mr. Williams here. Mr. Williams may sound familiar to you because he was, in fact, the head of the criminal division of the United States Justice Department here in Miami until last Friday at 5 p.m., at which point he decided to retire, and he now is going to be in the business of representing, he said, and I said, professional criminals, Your Honor, I think is the term you're looking for here. And he said, okay, Mr. Sheehan, that's it? He said, I don't want to hear any more like that. I've heard about you, he said. And I want to make it clear that what I've done is I have sealed your complaint. And if you so much as breathe a word as to the existence of this complaint, much less anything that is in it, to anyone, another soul, I'm going to put you in federal prison for 6 months for direct criminal contempt of this court. And so I said to him, I said, well, that's pretty interesting. I said, I don't know exactly what kind of authority you think you have to do something like that. He said, well, he said, you may not be familiar with the federal rules of civil procedure here in the Middle District or in the Southern District of Florida. I said, well, I assume they're the same federal rules that apply everywhere else that my professor actually at Harvard Law School, Shapiro, happened to have written, and our class in civil procedure happened to work on them. So I happen to know exactly what they are. I assume you're talking about the provision that authorizes a federal judge to have some discretion to take steps to protect a jury against adverse publicity. And he said, well, yes, that's the one. And so I don't want to have any publicity about this case whatsoever. In case we have to seat a jury sometime here, he said, gentlemen, he turns to all the lawyers and said, gentlemen, I'm not suggesting that this case is ever going to get to trial. he said. But in case it does, I've imposed this restriction on you, Mr. Sheehan. I wanted to have you here physically in person so you would know that there's no question about this. I said, well, I don't have any question about what your order is, but it's completely unconstitutional. I don't have the slightest intention of paying attention to it. And he says, well, I just wanted to make sure that you were on notice. So I said, okay, are we done here? He said, yes, we're done. So I leave. Go out and fly back up to Washington, D.C. The next day I come back into my office and I call up Russell Hemingway. Russell Hemingway is a great guy, was an old friend of John Kennedy's in the United States Navy, very sophisticated guy. Is the head, was the chairman of the Fund for Constitutional Government in Washington, D.C. prior to my chairmanship of it, so I knew him. And he's the head of a thing called the Fund for an Effective Congress and raising money for candidates for the Congress. And I told him what had happened, and he said, look, I'm gonna give a call over to Tip O'Neill right now, who is the Speaker of the House of Representatives from Massachusetts. He said, I want you to go on over there. Go ahead right now, head on over there. I'll give him a call. He'll meet with you, and I want you to tell him exactly what's happened here. So I leave the office, and I go on over to the Hill, and I go to Tip O'Neill's office, and there's Tip with his chief of staff there. And so I give him a copy. I give them both copies of the complaint, and I tell them what's happened. And so he looks through the copy of the complaint along with his chief of staff, and he says, look, these are clearly impeachable offenses that are here. These are impeachable offenses against not only Ronald Reagan, but George Bush, Bill Casey, the head of the CIA, Alan Fears, the head of the Latin American operations for the CIA. You know, a dozen people here who would have to be impeached. And I said, yes, that's right. And he said, well, you know, the Democrats are in charge of the House of Representatives right now, and therefore the Judiciary Committee under Peter Rodino. But even if we returned articles of impeachment against these people, the Republicans are still in control of the Senate, and they would just simply refuse to convict anybody, no matter what evidence you showed them. So we would have to wait until we find out whether or not the Democratic Party is going to take control of the Senate here in the fall of 1986 in November, at the November elections. But I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I want you to go upstairs over in the Hart office building, and I want you to sit down with Claiborne Pell. Claiborne Pell, the Democratic senator from Rhode Island, is the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And if you tell him about this, ask him if he will agree, if the Democrats take over the Senate here in the fall, whether he'll convene a special select committee in the United States Senate, in the Foreign Relations Committee and Foreign Affairs Committee, and take up an investigation of this. And if he agrees to do that, he's going to ask you, who do you think should be in charge of that committee? Who should chair it? And he said, you should tell him John Kerry. He loves John Kerry, he said. We all kid him that everybody thinks that John Kerry must be his illegitimate son. He loves him so much. He thinks he's going to be president of the United States. I said, well, gee, so does John Kerry. And he said, yes, we know. He said, so you go on up. So I go upstairs, I sit down, I meet with Claiborne Pell. Tip calls him up, and so I go up and see him, give him a copy of the complaint. He asks me, who should be in charge of this? I tell him John Kerry. He said, that's great. Okay, we'll do it if we get elected. So I go back to my office, right? It's 13 blocks away. I walk on back to my office on North Capitol Street, and which was this old former cobbler shop that had been given to us, that we all had our offices in. And so I walk in, and Patty Austin, my secretary, she says to me, Danny, there's an older gentleman who's waiting to see you here. And I said, really? I said, who is it? And she said, I don't know. He didn't give me his name. I said, well, where is he? He's up in your office, waiting for you up there. So I go upstairs, and I walk upstairs, and here's this guy, maybe 70 years old or so, sitting in there waiting for me. I walk over and introduce myself. He doesn't tell me what his name is, but he's sitting there in the chair, so I go over and sit behind my desk, and he says, look, he said, you don't know who I am. I said, yes, I noticed that. He said, but maybe if you would just answer a few questions I have, maybe I could help you out on this. He said, and he opens up his briefcase and he takes out a copy of the complaint that we had filed on Friday. And he says, I have a copy of your complaint here. He said, and I'd just like to ask you a question. He said, can you tell me, of these 26 defendants that you have listed here, he said, who do you think the most important of these 26 defendants is? I said, that's really easy. I said, it's actually Theodore Shackley. And he looked and he said, that's interesting. He said, why do you say that? I said, well, a lot of people would think it was because Theodore Shackley was the ADDO. He was the Associate Deputy Director for Operations for the agency when George H.W. Bush, now the Vice President under Reagan, was in fact the Director of the CIA. And because directly under him was Donald P. Gregg, who was the CIA case officer for Felix Rodriguez, who is the one running the Ilopango air operations for the Contras. And so a lot of people would think that's why I put him in there as the most important. And he said, but that isn't the reason why he's the most important? I said, no, not really. And he said, well, what is? And I said, well, it's because Theodore Shackley was the CIA station chief in Miami on November 22nd of 1963. And he looked at me and he said, there aren't 5 people in the world that would have answered that question that way. And he gets up and he walks over and sticks out his hand. He says, my name is Dick Billings. I was the chief staff writer and investigator for the House Select Committee on Assassinations that investigated the assassination of President Kennedy. I think you and I can help each other out, he says. He said, there's a guy that I think you need to meet. Would you be willing to meet with someone tomorrow, right away? And I said, sure. He said, where would you like to meet so you'll feel comfortable about this? I felt like Al Pacino in The Godfather, trying to figure out where I'm supposed to. I said, can you stick a gun behind the toilet if I have to? So I said, okay, let's go down to the Dubliner, right down the street from here. She says, fine, 12 o'clock tomorrow. So I go over to the Dubliner the next day at 12 o'clock, and there's Dick Billings standing out front waiting for me. I walk up and shake his hand. He walks me in, and here was this other guy, like about 70 years old, sitting in the restaurant all by himself. We walk over, and Dick Billings brings me over, and he says, Dan Sheehan, Joe Smith. And so I stick up my hand, I shake his hand, I thank you, Joe Smith, great. He said, no, I get that a lot. He said, my name is Joseph Burkholder Smith. I was the CIA deputy station chief in Mexico City in 1973 when Theodore Shackley was made the head of Western Hemisphere operations for the agency. And I said, well, that's interesting. So we sit down at this little table in the Dubliner Cafe, and he said, there's something I think I should tell you about these people that you've sued here. And I said, what is it? He said, well, back in 1973, Theodore Shackley was made the head of Western Hemisphere operations right after he was taken out of Vietnam. He was moved out of Vietnam as the CIA station chief in Saigon and made the head of Western Hemisphere operations. I said, yes, I know that. And he said, well, you don't probably know why he was taken out of there. I said, well, certainly I do. And he said, well, you probably don't. I said, well, I do, actually. He said, well, what do you think? And I said, well, because he was, in fact, as the CIA station chief in Saigon, running the Phoenix program, which was a political assassination program. It was being funded by the smuggling of opium that his people were doing, along with Vang Pao, who was one of the major opium warlords in Laos. And in fact, he was planning to assassinate Sihanouk in Cambodia. And he said, wow, he was, yes, that's right. I said, and in fact, he thought that there was this young guy who was a South Vietnamese CIA agent who turns out may have heard about that, may have known about that, because he knew some of the people that were involved in the operation. And it turns out that his mistress is also the mistress of a North Vietnamese colonel. And so that Shackley was afraid that he might be a source of a leak about the planned assassination. And so he wanted to have him murdered. And so Shackley ordered the murder of this guy, and he assigned these 5 guys in his group of special operations guys to murder this guy. And they actually ordered his best friend, who was one of the 5 guys, to do the actual killing so that he wouldn't rat them all out. So they took the guy and they bound him all up, kidnapped him, bound him all up, took him out in a lake, and the guy put 3 slugs in his head and tied rocks to him and dropped him in the lake. He said what happened is after a few weeks, this guy started feeling terrible about what he had done, and he went and told Creighton Abrams, the commanding general at the time of the U.S. forces in Vietnam, and he confessed to having done this and that Shackley had ordered them to do it. So they started this major investigation of this entire operation, and so the CIA pulled Shackley out of Vietnam to get him out of the crosshairs of this investigation and brought him back to the States and made him the head of Western Hemisphere operations. And he said, well, I guess you do know what happened. I said, yes, that's why I'm here. And he said, well, let me tell you something. He said, when in 1973, when Shackley came on board as the new station chief, or the new head of Western Hemisphere operations, he removed all of the station chiefs of every single one of the CIA stations in Latin America, because he said that Phil Agee, a former member of the CIA, was getting set to write a book, which ended up being called Inside the Company. And he may have found out the names and identities of some of the station chiefs. So Shackley, as the new head of Western Hemisphere operations, used this as an excuse for removing all of the CIA station chiefs and putting in his own people. And he put a guy in by the name of Tom Polgar to be the new head of the CIA station in Mexico City. And Tom Polgar came into my office as soon as he showed up, and he said, Joe, I don't know whether I'm going to be able to keep you on here as my deputy, but there's going to be somebody coming in tomorrow morning at about 10 o'clock in the morning to your office. You'll recognize him right away, and he's going to ask you some questions. And depending upon how you answer these questions, that'll determine whether or not I'm going to leave you on as my deputy. He said, and he may even have some other people he might want you to go see, and they'll have some questions for you. And depending on how you answer those questions, that'll determine whether you're going to be left on as my deputy. So the next morning, he says, I'm sitting here with Joseph Burkholder Smith sitting at this little table at the Dubliner Cafe. This is now about June 2nd or so of 1986, along with Dick Billings sitting here with us at the table. And he says, the next morning, he said, into my office walks Nasser Haro, who is the head of the DFS in Mexico, which is like the combined FBI and CIA in Mexico. And he walks into my office and he says, Joe, I imagine that Polgar told you that I was going to be coming to see you. And Joe said, well, I didn't know exactly who it was going to be, but he said somebody was coming. And so Nasser Haro says, I've got a few questions for you, but there's some other people that got some questions for you too. If you'd come with me, I'd like to have you meet with these people. So he says, I go with him. And he takes me downstairs, and we get in this Suburban with the tinted windows and drive away, and we go to the Mexico City airport, completely around all the security, and we get into this Learjet, and we fly away, and we're flying, and we end up landing in Buenos Aires, in Argentina. And we get out of the Learjet, and we go around security again, and we get in a helicopter, and we fly away, and we fly clear up to the northern tip of Argentina. Where these 5 countries all come together in South America. He said, we landed in the helicopter on this soccer field, he said. And I get out of the helicopter and I follow Nasser Haro across this soccer field, and we go up this big embankment, and I looked over the embankment, and he said, and I thought I was in Bavaria, he said. And I look over there, and so I follow Nasser Haro over the hill down into this little town, and we go into this like Bavarian inn that's there in Salta. I walk in, there are these 6 guys sitting at this big oak table in front of a big, huge stone fireplace. And on the mantle of the fireplace is a huge swastika flag. And I was kind of stunned at this, and they gesture for me to come over and sit down in the one chair that's on the other side of the table. So I come over and sit down, and here are these 6 guys, and the guy right across the table from me says, Joe, he said, we've got some questions for you, and depending on how you answer these questions, that'll determine whether you're going to be left on as the deputy at the station here. And so we want to tell you, we have spent lots of time and money putting together a major cocaine cartel down in Colombia. And this cocaine is going to be being transported up and sold in the United States. And a portion of the profits are going to be used to help fund our war without boundaries against your enemies and ours. And we wanted to make sure that if you were left on as a deputy station chief, there wasn't anything you were going to do that was going to interfere with this. And so Joseph Burkholder Smith says to me, and Dan, he said, I got to tell you, he said, I swear to God, he said, I don't know what I'd ever done in my whole life that would have led them to believe that I would have gone along with that. And I said, how about being the deputy CIA station chief in Mexico City for a start? And he got kind of taken aback by it. And he turns over to Dick Billings and he says, gee, I thought he was going to cooperate with us. And Billings says, look, I just met the guy. He says, and so Joseph Burkholder Smith gets up from the table and he walks all the way across the table and he reaches out and he walks over to me and he sticks his hand out to me like this to shake his hand and he says, I just wanted to tell you that if you're going to be dealing with these people, who you're really dealing with. That's what he said. So the question is, what the hell does that mean? What does that mean? Okay? And what you're going to find out in this class as to what it means is that there were a whole large number of people taken from the Third Reich at the end of World War II with the direct cooperation of our intelligence agencies and the OSS and evacuated out of Germany, hidden from the people that were in charge of the Nuremberg war crime tribunals. And they were brought to Argentina and Bolivia and Brazil and Uruguay. And they came in there and they were housed there and secreted there. And they have ended up being major advisors to a lot of the fascist regimes that are down in Latin America. And these were some of these people. And that these people were based down in Argentina, in Salta. And that they, in fact, are working hand in glove with the directors of the Central Intelligence Agency down in Mexico City, which is the base of operations for Latin America. And they were telling me this, that if you're going to deal with these people, you have to know who you're really dealing with at base. And we're going to cover a lot of this stuff in this course. So you'll know that it isn't going to do any good for us just to shift a few deck chairs around on the deck of the Titanic, by getting this officer out or this head of the CIA out or a new person in, that there are fundamental structural problems that exist in the United States government now that have existed for a long time, and that you have to come to grips with these things if we're really going to solve some of these fundamental problems. So now that you've heard the anecdote for today, the fact of the matter is that Theodore Shackley just died 2 years ago. Okay? And the fact of the matter is Tom Polgar, the guy that he selected to be the head of the station down in Mexico City, was chosen by the United States Senate to be their chief investigator during the Iran Contra investigations. So they chose this guy, a hand-picked guy of Theodore Shackley, to be in charge of the investigation for the United States Senate, allegedly investigating the off-the-shelf enterprise that was being run by Theodore Shackley and being populated by all the CIA people that were the same people that ran all the drugs in Southeast Asia, who were running the drugs and weapons down into Latin America to try to support the Contras, who were in fact fascists, just like these other people were. So the fact of the matter is they're not all dead. And the fact of the matter is that George H.W. Bush, who was the head of the Central Intelligence Agency and who was directly involved with his national security advisor, vice presidential national security advisor, Donald P. Gregg, is now got his son getting ready to run as the second son to potentially be president of the United States. Who in fact we saw directly meeting with all the terrorists and stuff that were blowing up airplanes and blowing up hotels and everything, who are just unbridled terrorists. And that he in fact is now being touted by virtually all of the corporate media now as being the likely candidate to go up against Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential election. So that these are current matters. This is not a matter of ancient history that we're talking about here just because a lot of these things happened before you were born. We're talking about people who are still alive, still effective, still functioning, and so that you're going to have to come to grips with the people. So the question that gets posed is what is the good news? Well, we have a little time left, so I'll tell you. But the first piece of good news on the logistical level is to understand that while, for example, we have the most reactionary Congress in the entire United States history since 1929, right now in place, since 2014, the reality is that the Democrats are going to take back the Senate in 2016, and almost anybody who has a political IQ above room temperature knows that. And yet they're not going to they're all going to pretend there's this big, gigantic drama going on and who can tell what's going to happen. The fact of the matter is that the reason that the Republicans took over the Senate in 2014 was because at that time they had 34 seats in the Senate were up for election, and 24 of those 34 were Democratic seats that were all being challenged. And only 10 of them were Republican seats. And so that the probabilities right off the start of the Democrats losing more seats than the Republicans is like a 2-to-1 ratio. And that's exactly what you saw happen. And that's basically what you saw happen. And the reality is that in the 2014 race, the senators that lost were the senators who had come in 2008 on the coattails of Obama winning the presidency in 2004. Okay, and so those people are the ones that were most vulnerable, and they were in a year in which the Democrats were twice as vulnerable as the Republicans were. This is all just a matter of structural content. And the reality is in 2016 it's going to be exactly the opposite way. And the fact of the matter is there are going to be 36 seats that are going to be coming up for election in 2016 in the United States Senate. 24 of those are going to be Republicans, okay? And only 12 of them are going to be Democrats. So the Democrats are going to have a 2-to-1 advantage in winning back the Senate with those races, okay? And the reality is that even though no one has told you this, the reality is in the 2014 election, more Americans voted for Democrats to be congressmen than did Republicans. Except that because of the gerrymandering that has been done of the congressional districts around the United States, the Republicans ended up, getting, what are the numbers here? They ended up getting 247 seats to 188 seats on the part of the Democrats, even though more people voted for Democrats to be congressmen than they did. Okay, so the reality is that all of this kind of media blather about the American people being much more conservative than they were before, and is all just blather. What really has happened is that the Republicans ended up organizing because the Koch brothers have been putting millions and millions of dollars in to taking over state legislatures around the country, and the state legislatures have been redistricting the districts in such a way as to gerrymander them all so that the Republicans, even though they get less votes in that state, get more congresspeople. Okay, so that's really what you see happening. So all of this lamenting and hand-wringing about the American people becoming much more conservative than they've been in the past is not what the proximate nature of the problem is. It's that these manipulations are going on with now millions and millions of dollars being able to be invested by the Koch brothers and others through their corporations into affecting the local state elections and the redistricting. So that's something we need to know in order to try to address how to solve this problem. Now, another factor that happened in 2014 is that the lowest percentage of you guys the people between the ages of 18 and 26, the lowest percentage of you voted in the 2014 election than happened since 1942. Okay? Ouch is right. You know, and that because of your not having gone in and voted, what happened is it distorted the results, and that there was the lowest turnout overall of all of the voters. That only 32% of eligible voters in the entire country voted in the 2014 elections. Okay? So that there was a much smaller percentage of people voting, and so that the Republicans were able to mobilize their right-wing Zanos that they have in the Tea Party and other places, and they all come out and they vote, and the young people stayed home, you know? And so that's what's really causing the problem. Only 29% of the people in New York State voted, you know? This is the lowest, as I said, since 1942. So that those type of demographics are important for you to keep in mind when you're thinking in terms of, well, what needs to be done to solve this problem. It isn't a matter of you having to sort of change the opinion of the vast majority of people in the United States. It's a matter of you guys and others coming out to vote in 2016, which, in fact, you will, because you're going to have the first woman candidate for president. So a lot of people are going to come out to vote for that reason. And people always come out, more of them, to vote during a presidential election. So that entire demographic of voters that didn't vote back in 2014 that are going to be coming back in to vote are virtually all going to vote Democratic. I mean, so all I'm saying is, you know, don't allow these people to bamboozle you into thinking that these platitudes that they're mouthing of, oh, the country's vastly more conservative, you know, it must be, you know, because of the terrorism and all of that. It's all propaganda. And if you do an analysis of the objective reality that we're dealing with, things are a lot better than they're trying to pretend they are for purposes of drama that they're engaged in. Okay? Now, a fourth very important resource that we have right now, sounds a little strange, is Pope Benedict. Or, excuse me, not Pope Benedict, thank goodness we got rid of him, but Pope Francis. But Pope Francis, old Benedict is sitting in jail inside the Vatican right now, so that nobody can serve subpoenas on him for all of the child molesters that the priests were in. But now you've got Pope Francis now. Pope Francis is getting ready to deliver a 50-page papal encyclical to the billions of people in the world that are Catholics all around the world on the issue of global climate change and its direct connection to transnational corporate capitalism, which he in fact is going to condemn, you know, broadside about it being the proximate source of the global warming on the planet, the global climate change, and is going to be calling all Catholics across the world to mobilize to do something to deconstruct the control of the transnational corporate capitalists around the world. Now, this is an extraordinary thing that's getting ready to happen here, and it's going to be coming out in probably the first week of June, a big 50-page encyclical. He's already now reversed several major decisions that were made by Ratzinger. And Ratzinger, it's important to remember to show what progress we've made. Ratzinger was a right-wing member of the State Department of the Vatican that supports fascists around the world, just like Pope Pius XII and his entire group of people did that signed the Concordat with the Nazis and the fascists in Spain and Italy. Those guys have all been ousted now. That he's firing those people hand over fist. He's fired the head of the Vatican Bank. He's now insisted upon making totally transparent all of the funds that the Catholic Church has. He's now devoting them to social justice. He's actually invited to come to the Vatican Paolo Freire, who is the author of the liberation theology that all these right-wing fascists in the church have been freaking out with their hair on fire over. And so he's demanded that every single pedophile priest be criminally prosecuted, not only not protected, but criminally prosecuted and imprisoned, rather than being given counseling, somewhere. And so that he in fact has publicly condemned the entire curia, accusing them publicly of spiritual Alzheimer's disease. This guy is going to be a major resource, an ally for any type of progressive activity that needs to be undertaken here over the next decade. All right? Now, the fifth major resource we have, which everybody talks about all the time, is the internet. That we now have the internet and all of the websites and everything. We have streaming. We're live streaming this. Anybody in the world that wants to see this class and your discussions that we're going to be having live can just tune in on the internet as long as they have a computer. All right, and we know what effect that had on the Arab Spring. We've seen movements like Occupy. We've got WikiLeaks that has been up now of Snowden having revealed all of this internal stuff that makes it absolutely clear that the people in the United States State Department are just lying, sea bags, so that we now have access to being able to expose a lot of the stuff that's been going on. And what's happening, of course, is the people that are in positions of power and authority are all trembling, saying, oh, look how unstable everything is now. Oh, the people that we put in power, and in Libya, and in Lebanon, and in Kuwait, and in Iraq, all these people are being ousted by these upstarts, with their cell phones, all running around organizing against these people. And I say, yeah, great. It turns out that's good. Because the way that it was before, the stability that they were all praising so much, it was a lot like Ronald Reagan. When Ronald Reagan said so famously, what's all this talk about a black problem? I remember when there wasn't any black problem. So when all the schools were segregated and no black people could vote, and he didn't think there was any kind of a problem at all. He didn't recognize it at all. Okay, and that's what's been going on. This kind of mellow period that everybody thought they were going through, everything being stable and reliable, and their little white communities were all completely safe from any kind of terrorist interlopers. That time is over. But you shouldn't be disturbed about it, because in order to fix things, you have to disassemble the structural sources of sin, as they say in the Jesuit 32nd General Congregation documents on justice, is that their obligation is to every day. Now, the Jesuit order, which in fact this Pope is the first Jesuit Pope in history, that the Jesuit order, in fact, in 1962, when Pedro Arrupe was elected to be the head of the Jesuit order, they've issued the 32nd General Congregation documents of the Jesuits saying that it is the obligation of every Jesuit priest every single day to take active steps to deconstruct the structural sources of injustice on the planet, and that obligation is equal to his preaching of the Mass every day. Okay, so what I'm saying is that you have this extraordinary resource here, not only with the Pope, but with the largest order of the Catholic Church, the Jesuits now, who are in a completely different mode of operation than they have ever been historically in the past, and that they're available as a resource. Now, the sixth major resource that you have, and I touched upon it yesterday or on Tuesday, is the whole boomer generation. The fact of the matter is, there's a book that I would recommend that you read. You don't have to read it, but I would recommend that you read it. It's called Generations, A History of America's Future. And it's written by William Strauss and Neil Howe, a Harvard and Yale sociologist, respectively, and that they've done a major study of the demographics of all the generations. And they have discovered, and I mentioned it just in passing on Tuesday, that there's been this constant cycle every 100 years when the civic generation, you guys, in the 21st century, has combined with the idealist generation of that century, that's the baby boomers, to gather together and to collectively confront the major crisis that arises in that 100-year period, which, as I've pointed out, is almost certainly going to be the continuing effects of global climate change and the massive disruption, economic and political and social, that's going to occur because of that, and the concomitant rise of a national security state, which is going to be used as the rationale, they're going to have it as a rationale for continuing to lock down on any kind of civil disturbances, okay? So that you have this additional resource. If you want to look that up in that book, you'll see that there's been this pattern recurring over and over again of our coming together and in fact rising to the occasion to address these major crises. Now the eighth, and now we're starting to get into some of the interesting content of the course here, and that is that an eighth major resource that you have is there is a major movement going on in the intellectual world. Just slam that if it's left open there. There's a major movement going on in the world right now toward integral thinking. And it's all predicated upon the discoveries that have been made since 1923 to 26 in the realm of quantum physics. That there's a major movement going on in the world that every philosophy major in the country needs to be aware of, if you haven't been made aware of it already. Because they're discovering that all kinds of the insights that have been derived through the discoveries in the realm of quantum physics is starting to reflect what the intuitive insights have been for the major mystical traditions for the past 3,000 years. And this is going to be an extraordinarily important resource, and we're going to be talking about this a lot during the course of this class. Okay, and
Ken Wilber?
Some of it is Ken Wilber, absolutely. That there's all kinds of books and writings about this, and we're going to be taking a look at some of these things. That basically what it's saying is that when they discovered between 1923 and 1926 with Max Planck and a bunch of the other, what they discovered is that when you start to break down the cell or break down the atom, which has been talked about ever since back in the ancient Greek Stoics, about all of the material world being made up of ultimately non-divisible units, which they thought was an atom. What they've discovered is the atom is in fact divisible. It's made up, as you know, of the neutron and the protons and the electrons. And what they've discovered is that if you break down the atom and you take the particles in the atom and you accelerate them in a particle accelerator and you collide them together, they break into smaller pieces. And they've then taken the smaller pieces and accelerated them and broken them down into smaller and smaller pieces. And what they finally have discovered is that you can break down matter, the material world, the condensed energy in the world, because as we all know here, is that all of the matter in the entire physical universe, all of the matter in the entire physical universe is made up of what we conceptually refer to as mass and energy. And that mass and energy are interchangeable. In fact, the degree of energy in a given unit of mass is equal to E equals mc squared. The mass times the speed of light squared that Einstein had discovered. That they're aware of the interchangeability of mass and energy. And what they've discovered is that when you break down the units of mass into smaller and smaller integers and you get down into smaller and smaller integers of energy, you eventually, after breaking them down into muons and leptons and others, they get down to a point where when they collide them together, that is, for all functional purposes, the mass disappears. And what you have is an inchoate quantum field. And this inchoate quantum field will remanifest itself in the form of matter, either in the form of a particle of mass or in a wave of energy. And then it will disappear again. It'll drop back into an inchoate quantum field. And then it will then manifest again in another millimicrosecond as either a wave of energy or a particle of mass. And it does so in a way that is completely unpredictable. That there is no discernible pattern that is established automatically in nature of the form in which it will manifest, again, as a unit of matter. But what they discovered, to the revolutionary surprise of everyone, is that if you take one of these inchoate quantum fields and you place it under observation, and an individual human being directs her or his direct human intention to that inchoate quantum field, attempting to get it to manifest in one of those forms rather than the other, it will in fact do so to a statistically significant degree. And that is absolutely revolutionary. And it's the most important single thing you're ever going to learn as philosophy majors in this school. Only you didn't know it yet, because they aren't talking about that stuff yet. They got you jumping all over things with linguistic philosophy and different theories and who said this, what did Hegel say, what did Nietzsche say, and they aren't getting down to the nut of the whole thing, but this is it. And the fact of the matter is, as well, the fact of the matter is, if you take two of these tiny particles, the smallest part, like leptons or muons, and you place them in an accelerator and you accelerate them away from each other, traveling at the speed of light, away from each other, and you direct a force against one of them, traveling away from the other one at the speed of light, and you move it off its straight line trajectory, the other particle will move instantaneously, which reveals the fact that in fact there is a force functioning in the universe that functions over distance, independent of time itself, and in fact it is operating in a unified way throughout the entire cosmos. Because this will happen if you wait for those two particles to be apart, and so they're at absolutely opposite ends of the entire physical universe, and you direct one of them out of its line of trajectory, the other one will move instantaneously. And so that there is a unified phenomenon bonding every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical universe into direct harmonious whole. And this is one of the most fundamental and profound insights of ancient Stoicism back in the Greek philosophy, that they would recognize that that the entire reality is one unified, harmonious monad. And this is what is referred to in philosophy as radical monism. All right? And what I want to share with you is another event that took place when I had just graduated from Harvard College and was up at Harvard Law School. And in our first year, this was 1967, the fall of 1967, when it was coming to the end of the first semester of the school year of 1967 to 68, that we all were told up at the law school that Crane Brinton, who was the founder and longtime chair of the Department of Intellectual History at Harvard University, was going to be delivering his final lecture on December 20th of 1967. And they had to move his lecture into a larger hall, into Lowell Hall, because there were going to be so many people coming from all around the world to listen to him in his last lecture. So I went down from the law school back over across the Mass Ave to the campus, and was there in Lowell Hall, and it was filled to the rafters. People hanging out of the windows and everything there on December 20th of 1967. And Crane Brinton came to the podium and he said that in my final lecture, I've been asked to address the question of what is the single most important intellectual insight that has been arrived at by the greatest minds in the human family based upon your 50 years of studying intellectual history. And he said, this is easy, he said. The most profound and important intellectual insight on the part of the greatest minds in the human family, he says, I have no doubt about, is the fact that our human species is at this moment on the very brink of a major step in biological evolution. And that we are in the process of evolving a new faculty. A faculty like seeing or hearing, but that this faculty is able to directly and immediately, experientially discern the unitive phenomenon that bonds every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical universe into one unified, harmonious whole. And that due to this direct experience, like seeing or hearing, due to this experience, he said, that each individual human being is capable of discerning what type of human conduct, individually or collectively, is either harmonious with or disharmonious to the natural order of the universe. And he said, and that's why I think so many of you young men here refuse to go and fight in this war in Vietnam. He said, to the standing ovation and cheers of all the guys that were there at Harvard College at the time. And this is something that's extraordinarily important for you to know about. We're talking about the chairman of the Department of Intellectual History at Harvard University telling the assembled studentry that this is the most important intellectual insight that the greatest minds in our human family have come to. And that is the concept that we're going to be addressing in this class. Okay? Now there's also one additional positive point that I'd like to make, and that is that all of us are at this point in time living in an absolutely unique and extraordinary period of time during which our human family is on the very brink of discovering the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence. See the smiles? I love that. I love that reaction. Because of the taboo. Because of the taboo that all of these major assholes that I'm talking about are brainwashing you too. Okay, just zapping you with that stuff. Ooh, don't talk about that stuff. But every person with a scientific and logical IQ now above room temperature knows perfectly well that there's extraterrestrial intelligence. And our United States government has known this for 50 years. Okay? And now we're now discovering that we've now got the Kepler up, the Kepler telescope, we've had the Hubble up. They're now starting to say they have now discovered over 2,300 planets, orbiting stars. They're right with our vision. We can see these. And 30 years ago, they were saying, well, we don't know whether there's any other planets in the entire universe. Now, why would someone say that? They would say that because they're functioning according to a particular worldview, which we'll talk about in this class, which is scientific logical positivism. And that is that unless you can see it, taste it, touch it, feel it with one of the 5 senses that have been consented to by the established order, unless you can see it, touch it, taste it, smell it, feel it, if you can't, and you can't measure it, then it doesn't exist. Then we don't acknowledge that it even exists, because you wouldn't want us to be saying that something is true when you can't absolutely totally prove it. And so that what they do is the only thing that they will acknowledge is things that fall into that category. And so therefore, the entire rest of reality that exists out beyond that set of establishable data functionally doesn't exist for them. And so even though there are 500 billion star systems, 500 billion star systems in just our galaxy, in the Milky Way galaxy, and that there are 500 billion trillion galaxies. These people 25 years ago were still saying, what, extraterrestrial intelligence? What are you, crazy? So the question is, who's crazy here? Okay? Who's crazy here? And what I want to do is make sure that when you get done with this class, you aren't among those people. You are not crazy. That you have the courage to stand up and say, what are you, nuts to think that there's not extraterrestrial intelligence? And the fact of the matter is, on these 2,326 planets that they've now discovered, they've discovered that almost 20% of the star systems in our galaxy actually have planets around them. And that in like a third of those, they have multiple planets. And they've actually started discovering planets now which exist in what they call the Goldilocks zone, which is it's not too far and it's not too close to the sun. It's not too far away, not too close, and it's just in the right place so that it will get adequate light from the star, adequate heat from the star, that they could actually have liquid water on the planets, and that they're made up of minerals and rocks, that these are real solid planets. And what they're doing is they're now in the process of moving step by step to start getting you ready for their announcement that they have discovered extraterrestrial life. And they're going to start out by first saying, we're finding planets where it seems that life is possible. Then they're going to find planets where they think life is probable. Then they're going to find planets where they think it's virtually certain that some kind of microscopic life lives. And then they're going to start saying they've discovered a planet with microscopic life. And then they're going to start getting you acclimated to the fact that, well, if there's microscopic life on these planets, that's how our life started on our planet. And so that maybe, in fact, over billions of years, it will have evolved intelligent life. And then they're going to start moving into finding primitive life, plants and amoeba, et cetera. And there's a whole process that's underway that's going to be taking place right during your lifetime. Now, I guarantee this, that right during your lifetime, there's an incremental step-by-step process by means of which they're going to be taking steps to get you acclimated to the announcement that they have discovered the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence. Now, all of this is completely separate and aside from the fact that thousands of people have seen them. All right? And thousands of people have seen them. And so all I'm trying to, and we don't have to get into that, but what?
I just wanted, just so it's not too out to lunch for everyone. Until I heard Paul Hellyer, are you familiar with him?
Yeah, I know Paul Hellyer. Yeah, I do.
The longest
Yeah, I do.
serving Minister of Defense
in Canada. That's right.
Cabinet.
Yeah.
He's recently come forward before the Canadian cabinet saying that the
Oh, yeah.
government has been in cahoots with the extraterrestrials.
Well, all I'm saying is that all you have to do, and you can read this book too if you want. You don't have to, but there's a book that's called UFOs in the National Security State. It's written by Richard Dolan. Richard Dolan is a PhD guy who's written. It's a 2-volume work, and what it is actual photostats of the internal classified documents that have been extracted from the Defense Department, the Central Intelligence Agency, the FBI, and others through the Freedom of Information Act, which he's assembled in a chronological order where you see them talking about this.
For real.
Okay? For real. Okay? And so that all I'm saying to you is, what I'm saying to you is separate and apart from all of that. I'm taking that and setting it off to one side right now because otherwise it's a lot like saying, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you like the play? So what I'm doing is we're setting all of that evidence aside, strangely enough, but to get back to this process of them discovering all of these planets and just slowly rolling out in front of you one step after another of discovering the viability of life, the practicality of life, the realistic probability of life, the discovery of life. All of this is happening right in front of you. And in fact, in 2009, on January, November of 2009, the Vatican itself held a major set of conferences with world scientists at the observatory at Gandolfo, at Castel Gandolfo in Rome, and then they came out and they issued a public statement that was that Father Fuentes, on November 11th of 2009, Father Fuentes is the head of the Vatican Observatory. And he came out and he stated publicly now that the church now understands that it's very probable that we're going to encounter extraterrestrial intelligence in the very near future. And therefore, it's time for all the people of the world, scientists and lay people alike, to begin a serious conversation about what the philosophical and theological implications are of discovering that extraterrestrial intelligence actually exists. And so suddenly our whole human family, after having been knocked out of the physical center of the entire universe by Copernicus and Galileo, and them actually saying, oh, the entire belief that we existed physically at the very center of the entire universe dislocated our whole family from bringing our human family from thinking that we're the center of all reality. They had this whole serious problem until they backed up and they constructed a pyramid in which we exist at the pinnacle of all life. That we are, in fact, the most evolved, sentient, intelligent life in the entire universe. And in fact, the whole universe exists just for us. That the whole physical universe is nothing but, in fact, a theater in which we're playing out our evolution toward higher and higher consciousness until we actually become cognizant of the fact that everything is unified and we're all part of one whole harmonic whole. That's the whole drama that they assert we are the main protagonists in. But suddenly we're not going to be the main protagonists any longer. And so what happens to us? What happens to the entire reality system that is based upon that set of assumptions? And so what the Catholic Church has announced now is that it's time, they don't want to get caught behind the power curve again on this thing. And so what they're saying is it's time for philosophy students, history students, government students, all the students in the world to start having a very serious conversation about what it means to suddenly discover that we are not the most intelligent and highly evolved species in the entire universe. What does that mean for us? And so what I'm saying is that is going to be a new worldview. A new worldview, because you take the entire 7 major worldviews that we're going to be talking about in this course, and the authoritarian worldview, the reactionary worldview, the conservative worldview, the moderate worldview, the liberal worldview, the progressive worldview, and the utopian worldview. You take these basic worldviews that we're going to be talking about in this course, and you discover that of those 7 worldviews, that one thing they all share in common. They all assume that we're the only sentient life in the entire universe, other than lower animals on our planet. So this is a radical shift that's going to be taking place. So there's going to be a new worldview that is going to be coming into existence during your lifetimes. And you can and should play a role in what that worldview is going to be, so that you don't abandon that responsibility and to allow the major transnational corporate capitalists to decide what the worldview is going to be, which is almost inevitably going to be, let's get them. Let's get these bastards, before they get us. And let's increase the military budget and design a huge, massive military program to be able to fight off these ultimate other, which in fact is a function of the second paradigm reactionary worldview that we'll talk about, which is where they live, these people.
Isn't there some kind of written plan by the U.S. government that, if terrestrials come to our planet, wouldn't they be involved in have enough technology that we wouldn't be able to get them?
Well, only if they're rational, and in fact, surprisingly enough, they are, but they don't talk about that. Those are all classified conversations that no one's allowed access to any of those conversations. That it's just like saying, isn't anybody planning on global climate change? Well, yeah, sure they are, but they aren't telling you about that. There's all kinds of plans being made as to what to do about it. You see the trains rolling everywhere, but they aren't talking to you about it. Just like in California. Isn't anybody planning for the great, big, huge, gigantic earthquake, the 9.0 that's going to destroy all kinds of... Yes, they are, but they certainly aren't going to talk with you about it, because if they did, half the people would leave, So that the attitude that they have toward we regular people is one of basically utter disdain. And so they aren't talking with us about these things.
Well, I'm confused as to how they're talking about it, because there's a lot of, I'm sure you know this, but in Diablo Canyon, the reactor's not set up for the earthquake. Now they've figured out that the San Andreas fault, the Hosgri fault, all of them are actually just one fault. So when an earthquake happens, it's just going to be huge, and everyone's going to get cancer. Everybody in California is going to get cancer country, or like in what way?
Well,
What do you mean?
it's the right question. That's the right question. You know, what is it that they're doing? I mean, given the fact that they're pretending that they're doing nothing, given the fact that, you know, you don't hear anything about it and there's no public discussion about what they're doing, what are they really doing? And it's difficult to say. That's what we have, our particular office for the last 45 years that I've been engaged in, is basically probing into things like that, to finding out what's really going on behind the curtain. What is it they're talking about here? And we'll touch on some of this stuff as we get into the course. But what I'm saying here in this second of the two orientation classes is that I'm trying to make clear to you that there are a whole set of resources that we have at our disposal, as long as you don't drink the Kool-Aid. You know, as long as you don't drink their Kool-Aid and come to believe that really what's going on is what the NBC National News is telling you each evening. You know, but when you really get down to figuring out what's going on and you get past that very temporary, I assure you, temporary period of disillusionment, and being concerned as to whether or not anything is going to hold, sort of like taking way too big a hit of grass, right? Bang, you know, and you go, you know, am I ever going to be the same? You know, from what I've read, is that so what I'm saying is that you are going to go through a period of some disillusionment and discomfort in realizing things ain't that way. But it's be absolutely necessary in order for you to come to grips with what's really going on in the world, so that you can figure out what it is that we can do about that. And these are the kind of resources that we're going to have at our disposal with which to do something about this. And in the two major instruments that we're going to be talking about here in this course are, with which we can work with this, is the Constitution of the United States and the natural law theory that undergirds the entire formatting and conceptual underpinnings of the Constitution of the United States. Because these are the tools with which we can mobilize and organize and take part in changing the world. Okay? So that's the importance of this particular course. That while in fact it's philosophical, and we'll touch on a lot of things having to do with philosophy, it's got to do with history, it's got to do with government studies, it's got to do with a lot of particular categorized courses. It's really a course in salvation. You know, how it is that we are going to participate in helping to save our country and our species from the consequences of the conduct of a certain element of people in the world that in fact are adherents to a particular worldview, two particular worldviews actually, the authoritarian worldview, the first paradigm worldview, and the second paradigm dialectical worldview of the reactionaries. That they form a particular coalition at the far right of the political spectrum, which have complete blinders on, and they're oblivious to the longer term consequences of their conduct, as long as they can in fact feed their wealth and power in sense of dominion over the rest of the world, which is in fact rooted ultimately in a cosmic anxiety that they have because of their lack of access to this particular faculty that we're going to be talking about. An actual faculty which, if trained and you direct your attention to it, that in fact can be strengthened continuously to the point where you are able to actually discern an experiential phenomenon which has been referred to cryptically all through the writings, not just of spiritual writings and mystical writings, but philosophy and history. That this phenomenon is something that has been touched on consistently, and that we're going to be talking about it in this course to try to get an understanding of it in the context of the discoveries in the realm of quantum physics and how they relate to the discoveries that have been made in the field of human biophysics, and what relationship that has to the Constitution. and to the natural law principles that undergird the Constitution. Okay, so that's where we are going to be going. What I would suggest is that over the weekend, of the various readings that I've suggested in the syllabus, that the three essays that we've put up on the e-commons today, which you'll have access to immediately after class, but they'll be integrated into the syllabus by tomorrow morning. That you touch on these. This is the Natural Law in the American Constitution by Charles Desmond. The short 3-page characteristics of natural law that is in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and the other article is in the American Journal of Jurisprudence, and it's a discussion of metaphysics, epistemology, and the natural law theory. It sounds a little more foreboding than it really is, but I would just suggest that you might want to sit down and take a look through those. And it's not going to be where I'm going to say, what did they say in paragraph 3, or give me the 3 major. I'm not into any of that stuff. What I want you to do is, I want you in this class, I want you to want to know what it is that's being said and the things that I'm just suggesting you can read. I want you to want to know, what it is that is known by other people and that you need to know in order to be adequate philosophers and historians and legal scholars and public intellectuals and the other careers that you have in mind, from which you're going to be working all together as a generation with us to help save the world. Okay, so so I want to always give us another at least 15 or 20 minutes for asking questions at the end. I don't want this just to be just a drink from the fire hose here. So I'll just sit and relax for a second and see if you've got any questions about what I've said so far. I know that it's abrupt whenever that happens. So yeah.
Well, it seems that NBC and Fox News cannot be trusted. What news source can be trusted, or like what outlet is talking about these issues?
It's very difficult for an outlet to garner the kind of resources that are necessary for it to basically be functioning on a whole national level without making the kind of compromises that you see reflected in these major corporations. So it's not that there's one single place you can go to and say, oh good, now I can depend on these people. What you're really learning how to do here is how to find individual essays and pieces around that can tell you this. And you just go on to Google actually with natural law theory, and that whole stack of essays that I had here with us on Tuesday, which we're going to put it up on e-commons for you to kind of search through some of those things. But you can do your own exploration under natural law theory on the internet and find some of these essays. And you'll automatically search through and get rid of the ones that are completely opaque, that nobody can really figure out what they're saying. If you get through a whole page and you can't figure out what they're saying, then just get rid of it and go to another one. But you can find certain information about certain subjects in different places. For example, The Nation magazine is one that is got a lot of data in it. Obviously, if you want to feel really bad each morning, you can listen to Amy Goodman. Amy comes on every morning at 9 o'clock, and she runs down the list of horrors that have taken place over the past 24 hours in the country and in the world. But there's the new thing. Intercept is a new group that has been put together by Glenn Greenwald and the people from WikiLeaks. That they've put together a regular news outlet on the internet called Intercept. There's another one that's called I think Who What When. What's his, the kid from Texas, Russ Baker, has an article that has good information each day. But they're not engaged in presenting a kind of a systematic overview of reality. They're just, you can tell from the way they select these particular stories that they're trying to get something through to you, in general. But those are a handful of some of the places that you can look right away. And there's also a brand new one. Someone just told me that there's a brand new website that's getting set. It just came up yesterday, but I'll get the name of it for you. Vice News. That there was a thing on HBO. It's HBO, and HBO had this show that used to be on every Friday night, I think, called Vice, and it shows events around the world that like massive global climate change and things like that. And they've now started just yesterday Vice News on HBO that you can get, and we'll have to see how that one goes. Okay.
Is the Tom Hartman show any good?
Yes. The Tom Hartman show is good. That's a Russian news. It's really of course. Then there's what's the news thing? The English Al Jazeera. There's Al Jazeera and Al Jazeera English that basically tells you stories from around the world that none of the networks will put on here in the country, and that they fought like mad to keep Al Jazeera off television, but Al Jazeera is one of them, and in the Russian news. Now you have to take into account the Russian news is that Russia is moving back more and more away from the kind of Gorbachev era of glasnost and perestroika, and now under Putin is now starting to take on some of the earlier characteristics of kind of an authoritarian state. And it's probably going to have some adverse effect upon the content of Russian television. I think it's like a RTS or something, Russian television station. And that's where Tom Hartman is. But there's a handful of regular American journalists that they've hired because they know they're very progressive. And so they're on that station, so you can catch that one. Okay, so there's a number of spots for you. Yes?
Well, a couple of questions. First, talking about news, can you sort of discuss the BBC and your thoughts on them? And then secondly, on a different topic, I was a little bit concerned after the Boston Marathon bombing, the kind of force that the government had on trying to find these people. It's one thing to investigate them, but to kind of mobilize the entire National Guard seemed a little bit scary to me. So can you talk about that and that sort of connection?
Yeah, I'll take them in reverse order. Yeah, the what you saw happen in Boston after the marathon bombing is symptomatic of a major movement that's going on in the country now, which is to militarize the police. That this has been a long time objective of advocates of the national security state ever since Ronald Reagan was the governor here in Texas or here in California. He in fact, back when he was governor, established a thing called Operation Cable Splicer. And Operation Cable Splicer was a war games scenario pursuant to which all of the law enforcement agencies in the state of California could be linked together under one operational command along with the National Guard and the United States military. And it was designed to be mobilized if and when the anti-war community in the state of California mobilized and joined together with the black nationalist organizations to try to overthrow the established government of California, which will just show you what he thinks about when he goes to sleep. But that was Ed Meese. Ed Meese was the Assistant Attorney General in charge of civil disorder control. And he brought on to be the new head of the California State National Guard a guy by the name of Louis Giuffreda. Louis Giuffreda had been the commandant of the California Organized Crime Training Institute down in San Luis Obispo, where they have all these guys in the black pajamas jumping out of trees on each other, and that was he. And he likes to be referred to as the commandant. He was brought with them when they came into Washington, D.C. in 2001 and put in charge of FEMA. And so the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which had been created under the Carter administration to deal with floods and hurricanes and other things, he tried to aggressively turn that into an anti-terrorist operation. Okay, so that's you can always watch them to see what it is in the ideal that they want to get put into place, and that was it. Operation Cable Splicer. Okay, and you can find information on the internet about it. Ron, can't remember his last name, or not, but he wrote a major article about it called Operation Cable Splicer, or no, Operation Garden Plot, which is a subdivision of that. More Than a Game, it's called. But this mobilization is taking place right here, where they're getting the Bearcat. You've heard all about it. They bought this tank here, that is ostensibly to protect the police officers against being shot. I mean, the two police officers walked right up and banged on the door of a guy that they knew was armed, and they shot him. And so they went and got a Bearcat, figuring that that'll protect them. But it's all of this stuff is being kind of foisted upon them by the Homeland Security Department in Washington. What they're doing is they're saying, here, we're going to give you a $250,000 grant, but you have to buy a Bearcat with it. And by the way, we have a Bearcat here if you want it. And so that's what they're doing. And they did the same thing with regard to these license plate readers. They are putting them all around the city. They're not just those things at the stoplights, where if you go through, they take your picture. But now what they're putting up random photograph equipment where it photographs your license plate and you in the car and anybody else that's with you, and they keep a record of where you're seen in the city. And they're sending it up into San Francisco to a major regional Homeland Security computer, so that they're monitoring it, so they can keep it there in the computer. So if they ever want to know where you were driving, anywhere where they have these surveillance cameras, they can know your entire pattern and what you're doing. So the second question that you asked, this kind of militarization of the police, like you saw at Ferguson and other places, and you saw in Boston, is getting to be the norm. And in fact, even Jerry Brown, when he was the mayor in Oakland, accepted a huge federal grant to allow them to use the city to practice door-to-door warfare. And they just had a thing on the internet where it was down in Nashville or Louisville somewhere. They just flew in like a dozen black Huey helicopters filled with 200 U.S. military people, practicing rounding up everybody in the community and marching them off and putting them in these white unmarked vans and driving them away. It's on the internet now. They just did this like 3 nights ago. So they're practicing this kind of thing.
Is there video? Where can we see this?
Yeah, I don't. Do you know how we found that one, Pat? With that? Well, anyway, I'll
Orlando, brother.
it was in Orlando. It was in Florida. Yeah, it was on the news. It was FEMA. Went in and did this practice roundup. So you were waiting earlier. Yeah.
I read about that same thing happening in Anaheim about a year ago, where they come and they had all these really high-tech military-grade equipment, and they go around, they grab people and throw them in white vans and take them off. And no one had any idea what was going on.
Yeah.
Just run for 3 days and then it disappeared off the internet. Couldn't have anything on it.
No. So what I'm saying is that it's important that you not become intimidated by this stuff, because I mean these guys get up every day and put their pants on one leg at a time. They're just regular people, and that they're just working off of fear mongering, and there's a whole set of bureaucratic imperatives of getting more and more money into their departments and all that kind of stuff. And so you don't want to set them up as the main bad guys. I mean, the fact is, one of the things we're going to be focusing on in this course is who are the main bad guys? Who are the ones that are proximately responsible for making these kind of decisions, and what is it they're up to? It's not the local police guys, who basically are high school graduates or something, getting paid, 13 grand a year. They're being brainwashed just like you are. Okay, so that what we have to do is try to focus on who the real bad guys are, so you can know where to put the levers in to be able to move these things. Okay, so we got 1 and 2. So, oh no, I promised him first. There you go. Then
So even as somebody who expects there to be a lot of intelligent life out there, I find it a little bit hard to believe that there's some kind of conspiracy cover-up without a little bit of justification. So there are a couple of things that I'm wondering. Who's involved in the cover-up? Are we talking about exclusively government bodies, or what about academia? How are astronomy departments unaware of this kind of thing? And secondly, why aren't there whistleblowers? Why aren't people blowing the cover-up?
well, actually there are.
Yeah.
There are dozens of people that have worked at Area 51. That you interview them, you can find them on the internet.
I want just their testimony though. Why don't they produce
Well, there's actually probably 6 major close-up, videos of UFOs and stuff everywhere. And then what they say is, well, maybe they faked it. And then you send it to technical experts and say, no, this is not fake. It's clearly, absolutely real, this picture. And then they say, oh, well, we don't know what it is. By that time, people have lost attention to it. The reality of it is that it's all over the place. It's kind of hanging out right in front of you in this thing. And with regard to the conspiracy of the thing, all it requires is them just saying no. I mean, you guys ought to, if you haven't seen it yet, there's this documentary that Participant Films did. Participant Films is another great resource that this fellow Jeff Skoll, who was one of the founders of eBay, has put in several $1 million and built this media company called Participant Films. They're the ones that did Seriana, and they did Good Luck and Good Night, about William or about Morrow. There's a whole bunch of movies that they're making with George Clooney. They did Michael Clayton. There are movies like that. But what this movie, this major documentary that Skoll just put out, is called Merchants of Doubt. And what it does is it documents in indisputable detail how the tobacco companies and the oil companies and others are flagrantly lying about reality. And they just keep saying it over and over and over again. And you see them wear down all kinds of regular people who don't have the time to look into things. And so that they just say, well, gee, it can't possibly be true that they're saying these things if it's not true. But it turns out that it is. And so there's a whole lot of information about this particular issue. But the best work that you can get is Dolan's, the UFOs, and the National Security State, because these are all internal, verified, certified documents from inside the various government agencies talking about this, including Twining's letter, who was the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, stating specifically that we've investigated this and we're convinced that these are from some other planet. And they're not ours or the Russians. We're convinced of that, and we need to do something serious about this. And so what they did is they retired him. And so you say, well, why would they do that? And then you get into some speculation as to why they might do something like that. And there's a whole Brookings Institute study that was commissioned by the Defense Department to try to get them to explain why the Defense Department should keep all this secret. And so they did. That's what they did. That's what said, oh, well, if you release it to the people, they'll all start panicking, and the stock market will crash, and people will stop, saving money, and they'll all run to the hills, and there'll be chaos. Which is just exactly what they wanted to hear. So that I would just recommend that 2-volume set for you. You can get it on the internet, on Amazon.
Okay, I have like 20 million things to say, so I'm just gonna narrow.
That's a good sign.
For right now.
That's a good sign.
So first of all, your question about Boston was interesting because I'm from Boston, so I lived through the Boston Strong thing, and I'm super liberal and stuff, so all of my friends started wearing Boston Strong shirts, and all of a sudden everyone was just brainwashed wearing these shirts every day, and no one said it, but there just became this underlying anti-Islam sort of thing, like no one talked about it, but all of a sudden everyone was scared of terrorists, and it just is amazing to me that 4 people being injured, or I'm not sure, but it was under 10 definitely, leads to just these huge military increases in military funding and such. What was the other thing? So I'm interested in along with life existing because of the distance from the sun and the fact that planets exist, there's also other features along with electromagnetic fields and such that makes it seem unlikely for life to exist. And I live with it could be that people even in the university are hiding facts or not completely aware of it, but from my astrophysics friends' calculations, they say that life existing is possible, but that the chances of them existing closer than 100 billion light years away is virtually zero. But I'm not sure how accurate that is. And then also, if there's UFOs that have been flying around, would NASA be aware of?
Pardon which?
Would NASA be aware of UFOs that are
Well, see, this is a lot of that subject I was telling you about is, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you like the play? The minute you bring this particular subject up, thinking and intelligent people all become fascinated by this particular issue. But the answer is they do have vehicles that have crashed. They've got the ones from Roswell, 1947, July. They're at Area 51. I've interviewed at least 3 people directly who've walked up and put their hands right on them. So they know right where they are. There's all kinds of data about this. So they are concealing this. But as I say, I don't want the credibility of the whole class to rest on this particular issue. So what I'm saying is that the avenue to that is through this discovery of these planets. For example, they have 8 of the planets now that are within 1.2% the size of Earth and density of Earth, and one of them has 46% as the amount of sunlight of our planet. One of them has a 129-day year. They're being able to calculate these things now, and they've got filters on the observatories that are out there now. They can filter out the bright sunlight to pick up these planets, so they can actually get full-scale views of the planets, so they can analyze what the atmospheric content is, etc. And there are ways to overcome these electromagnetic areas. That, for example, they were at the early age of the space age here. They were very concerned about people going outside of the gravity field of the planet as to what's going to happen. What happens to our capillaries? What happens to the blood flow in our body when you're in a completely weightless condition? There's all kinds of things that they set up as potential barriers for believing that any of this could possibly work. Just like they said that you couldn't have back in the 1840s, they were saying that you couldn't possibly have a train that would go over 40 miles an hour because everybody would suffocate in the train, because the train would be going faster than the air inside of it, and it would all get sucked out the back. And reputable scientists were like, sure, let me show you the formulas why that can't possibly happen. So what they do is they get locked down onto a particular mindset, and that they just look for evidence to what supports them. Now, I should point out now, look at that we're now at the point here where we're into the time coming up at 6 o'clock for the optional discussion session, because that apparently, according to the policies of the school, we're not supposed to have these sections that are mandatory for you to be at in the first week. So it's voluntary. Anything from this point forward, people have classes or other things, or your mother's horse died and you have to go immediately address it. Anything you need to do. So why don't I give you like 5 minutes for a break at least, and then we'll be back, and we'll start at 6 o'clock actually, so it'll give you a little more than that.
Is it possible to still add the class or no?
Pardon?
Is it possible to still add the class or no?
To do what?
To add it.
Oh yes.
Yeah?
I think you can. Yeah. Today's still open. Yeah.
I think when I went on, it said like the section was full, so I couldn't.
Well, that's because. should find them, because we'll talk about that set of experiments here. I have to find where they are.
Okay.
But you can find them. The Downstate Medical Center,
Downstate.
1968, and it was a whole set of experiments that were done, working with Indian fakers and Buddhist monks and Trappist monks and others, measuring the energy fields around their bodies and
I've
stuff.
come across that before.
But
Yeah,
it's
I
a
do
big one.
remember that.
It's a big one. And there's the what's it called? Something Institute, Monroe Institute.
Monterey.
Are you? You're not.
It sounds familiar.
It's Monroe, the Monroe Institute. It's up in, I think, Michigan. Is it Favor, Virginia? Oh, it's down in Virginia. That's right, down in Virginia. Yeah, the Monroe Institute. It's totally fascinating, and they do all kinds of this stuff. And you want to pursue things now with the skills you're learning that you were genuinely fascinated about when you were younger.
Okay.
And don't let them talk you out of it,
All right.
because that's the pathway to your bliss, actually.
Okay.
Okay?
All right. Thank you.
Terrific. What's your name?
Eric.
Eric. Terrific, Eric. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we're at 6 o'clock, and I have to agree to let everybody go. Well, of course, it's all voluntary anyhow right now, but because we don't want to be in violation of the school's rules. So we have more time. We have more time to chat, talk. So I'm not going to blather at you. I'll just answer questions.
How come the U.S. is more concerned with like terroristic attacks and like not like attacks between our borders, between like police, people of color?
Why are they more concerned about attacks from terrorists overseas than they are about revolution?
Then yeah, or like domestic brutality, yeah.
Well, that the reality of it is that the question is, why are the officials in the United States directing more attention to terrorism coming from outside of the country than they are directed toward potential of revolts or violence or terrorist attacks generated here at home by domestic people? Well, the short answer to it is because they're perfectly aware of the fact that they've invaded and occupied the Middle Eastern oil fields, and that there are organized, systemic faith groups that are mounting a major effort to drive them out of the Holy Lands, and that they're aware of the fact that rather than having to just frontally combat tens of thousands of U.S. military troops with all their fighter planes and bombers and all that kind of stuff, that they've resorted to the utilization of certain types of what they call terrorist tactics to go after soft targets and to ratchet up the pain and anguish that's being inflicted upon the country people of the perpetrator states, in order to build up political pressure inside those states to make them stop doing it and withdraw. And there isn't a phenomenon like that going on inside the United States. There was at one time the Black Panther Party and the Weather Underground and others that had actually gotten mobilized and organized in a kind of a more or less comprehensive way to actually take on the power of the state in activity that would be characterized as terrorist activities. And at that point, you saw a much higher level of interest on the part of the major law enforcement and military here in the United States attempting to crush and destroy them, and assassinate them. And they had a whole thing called COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, where they infiltrated them and tried to goad them into doing things like they're doing with terrorists now, trying to goad them into here, I've got a whole truckload of C4, and here I'm going to give it to you, and it turns out it's an FBI undercover agent, trying to talk you into doing something. They're doing that with regard to purported terrorists now, and they did it with regard to the Black Panther Party, the Weather Underground, and others in the 1960s and 70s. And so that it's all a matter of how much of a threat they think that type of organizing is going to be. But you can be sure that they will direct more attention to that if, in fact, that starts to take place. Yeah. Well, tell me your names, you guys, so I can remember. Darian.
What is your opinion on the militarization of police in the U.S.? It's becoming more and more of like a main light issue that a lot of people are focusing on now, but what do you think is the next step? Right now we're just seeing that when a cop kills somebody, they're finally having the cop looked at by an organization that isn't their own department. But do you think that this is an issue that can be fixed through regular channels, or is this going to require something a lot more, I don't know, systemic, I guess? I don't know how to...
Well, there's two, okay, the question is, and I have to repeat the question because some people can't hear it, that with regard to this militarization of the police, and you point out two sub-questions under there. One of them is this instance where police beat up on black young men or minorities and use unwarranted force against them, sometimes fatal. And then there's the other issue, not totally unrelated, but somewhat distinct, of the massive militarization of the entire police department, of being given military equipment and dressing and acting like military cadres, you know, mounted into the cities against the people.
But also, you know, their ability to almost ignore the law in most cases, even the body cameras that they try to install don't really help if you can turn the body cameras off.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that there is a conscious effort that's been mobilized since the end of the Cold War and the initial gathering together by Paul Wolfowitz and David Addington and Doug Fife and Elliot Abrams and Cheney and Wolfowitz and those guys, that they enunciated a full-scale kind of worldview of full spectrum dominance. Remember that I've referred to before. And while they're talking about, you know, fielding full spectrum dominance outside of the country against any other potential forces in the world, the fact of the matter is that tends to bleed through into domestic policy. And so that at the same time, those same people, to the extent to which their power and influence is not confined simply to foreign affairs, they turn and they have effect upon internal domestic policy. And so what they do is they automatically respond to full spectrum dominance. And so what you want to do is you want to mount up and militarize your police so that they have unquestioned massive military authority over anybody that might try to resist them. And so that's why you get the Bearcat, and you get to see these kind of major mobilizations with, you know, these big 50 caliber machine guns on top of the Bearcats. And, you know, I mean, what do you need a 50 caliber machine gun for, you know, against civilians? And then they'll say, oh, well, you know, there's a chance that one of them might get a hold of a large weapon, and we'd have to have a larger weapon to beat them. And so the same kind of weird authoritarian kind of thinking that motivates their foreign policy starts to affect their domestic policy, and that's what happens. But with regard to the sub-issue that you raise about the application of unwarranted force on the part of individual or small groups of police against young black men, et cetera, especially, this has been going on for a long time. You know, that this thing that like I mentioned earlier, where Ronald Reagan said, "What's all this? I'll just talk about a black problem." You know, the fact of the matter is, white people aren't aware of it that much, but all black people are aware of it. You know, that the police that are dispatched into black neighborhoods are at least until very recently 99% all white, and that they're a military force. And they sweep the streets and they arrest black guys and they hassle them all the time and they shake them down and they, you know, drag them in. And, you know, I mean, it's been going on for a long, long time. And efforts have been made by various organizations, from NAACP to the ACLU, to a lot of them to try to stop that type of thing. But the problem is that the ACLU, et cetera, is made up of mostly white people. And the fact is the white people don't feel as motivated to really get down after that kind of stuff because it ain't happening to them. I mean, frankly. And so no matter how liberal a lot of people are that are in ACLU, et cetera, I did all the trials for ACLU for 10 states, so I know. You the hierarchy inside ACLU, do not share the same type of sense of immediacy as people who are actually going to be subjected to that type of criminal activity on the part of the police departments. So one of the solutions is, of course, is having a lot more young black women and men get trained to be lawyers, so that they can field forces against these type of police, and that's something systemic like that has to be done. But it's an overwhelming problem right now because this whole privatization of the prisons, and that we have the highest percentage of our population per capita of any place in the entire world imprisoned now, and it's a big profit-making operation with the corporations. So that there's a whole lot of major systemic changes that need to be brought about in order to deal with these things, which are in fact symptoms of the fundamental malady that we're talking about here in this class.
How are the corporations benefiting from the jail system?
Oh, they're private corporations that are for-profit corporations now. That they've actually, under the Reagan and Bush administrations, they turned over the control of major prisons to private corporations, because they had this whole kind of weird ideological theory that private corporations can do everything better than government. That this whole bizarre attitude they had is that government is inherently driven by bureaucratic imperative as distinct from profit motive. And so you get weird things like that happened in Pennsylvania, for example, where you had a judge that was being paid by the prison corporation to put young people into the prison. And so that the judges were actually being paid per conviction. And so the kids that were in the high school that talked back to one of the teachers or something, they would snatch them and they would bring them in front of the judge, and he would incarcerate them for a year for it. And then he would get a kickback from the prison corporation for putting the kid in jail. Now those two judges happen to have gotten discovered and prosecuted, but that type of motive on the part of the corporation to get more and more people in there. Corporations are completely heartless and soulless, and they have no conscience whatsoever. The only motive driving them is to maximize their short-term profit, so they can give more money to the stockholders as royalties. That's what they do. And so that you shouldn't be surprised that they just become avaricious about getting more and more people in. They actually lobby in the state legislatures to increase the number of crimes so that they can get more people into their prisons. And people who understand corporations go, yeah, naturally, that's just what they would do. But people are shocked to find out that they do that. It appears on the face of it to be so fundamentally unethical, but that doesn't bother corporations because they don't have any ethos, they don't have any conscience, they don't have any soul. That's why the extension of fundamental human rights to corporations is such a ludicrous concept, because it flies completely in the face of the entire understanding of natural law that has to do with why human beings are endowed with fundamental rights, and corporations ain't. So that's how they profit from it.
It's a lot like how psychiatrists are paid for every 4-year-old that they diagnose with ADHD. But,
They get kickbacks from the pharmaceutical corporations that they prescribe Ritalin, and for every prescription of Ritalin they get a kickback. And so that you can see what the kind of momentum is that will just set in. Even if people aren't, at least the doctors aren't malicious themselves. We discovered it in the case we're doing up in South Dakota right now. When George W. Bush was the governor of Texas from '96 to 2000 in Texas, he was the first governor in the entire country that actually initiated a policy of having every child that's going to be coming into the state foster care system have to have a mental health screening test. And so what he did is he had the screening test drafted up by the Eli Lilly Corporation, because his father happened to be on the board of directors, and the chairman of the board of Eli Lilly happened to be the father of Dan Quayle. And so he just said, oh, well, they know about mental illness stuff because they make pharmaceuticals for that, so let's have them draft up the test. And so they drafted up a test that all the questions were symptom specific. And so they went looking for these symptoms among these kids. And so that it ended up with it that 63% of all of the minority children that were administered this test flunked the test and were determined to be in need of one or more of the pharmaceutical drugs that were produced by the Eli Lilly Corporation. You know, and then it set in, and the Eli Lilly Corporation started making lots of money because then they decided that they were going to declare any child who flunked the test to be a, quote, special needs child. And so therefore, under the Federal Adoption and Safe Families Act, that would send money into a state to care for individual children who were having trouble being trapped in the foster care system, that they couldn't get any kind of permanent placement because they were acting out and having issues, that the federal government, the Clinton administration actually, in 1997 passed the Adoption and Safe Families Act to send up to $79,000 a year into the state to give special attention to such a child. And so what they did in the state of Texas is any child who flunked the Texas mental health algorithm test, they would declare them to be a special needs child and apply for this up to the $79,000, and it would come into the state, and then they would only pay out $9,000 to $12,000 to the foster care parents, and they would keep the rest of it for their budget. But then they were using half of that budget to purchase pharmaceuticals from the Eli Lilly Corporation. And so that all of a sudden, a whole big influx of profit started flowing from Texas to the pharmaceutical corporation, right? And so the CEO of the pharmaceutical corporation, Eli Lilly Corporation, started giving bonuses out of those profits to the people that were responsible for the account in Texas, right? And then he'd go around to them and ask for soliciting voluntary campaign contributions to W's presidential campaign in 2000. And then they were giving him the money. And that's part of how he got to be elected or selected.
Do you know how the kids are getting taken care of? Is it basically just like they pay the foster parents to keep the kid, right?
Yeah, $9,000 to $12,000 to pay for their costs. Yeah, and what we discovered here is that there are, and you'll discover this in the course, there's a combination of kind of what they call scienter in the law, which is kind of an evil or malevolent intent. But otherwise, there's a thing they have, the bureaucratic imperative. There are these kind of bureaucratic forces that start to manifest themselves with regard to institutions, and they let themselves get swept up with those bureaucratic motives, and then they start doing things that are completely immoral. You know, but the institution doesn't have any kind of conscience or sensitivity to it. They're governed and driven by their bureaucratic objectives. So that's the kind of thing that we discover all the time. So that what you have to do is you have to go after the structural sources. The structural sources, and one of the principal structural sources, and we'll talk a lot about it in this course, is that one of the principal structural sources of the injustices in the country here and in the world is the existence of the corporation. This corporation that allows the owners of the resources for the corporation and the access to the profits to be completely immunized against any liability for anything that the corporation does. And the same thing is true of the management officials. They're completely immunized against any personal liability. You know, and that's the whole idea. It's the whole idea of the corporation. So you say to yourself, yeah, well, why wouldn't they do that? If they can do it, well, why wouldn't they do that, given the fact that they have no conscience? So that's what happens. Just say, we'll have more, yes.
Last week you were talking about like an alliance between Western powers, and I was wondering what you thought like the degree of that alliance would be, like war, trade, resources, and also we've been like taught in school and like China's gonna become the next world superpower.
Yeah.
Like they're gonna run stuff, and I'm thinking like do you like envision like a war, like a confrontation between like the unified Western powers and China?
Yeah. There's two questions. Do I perceive of there being any kind of realistic risk of there being a major military and cultural confrontation between China and the alliance of Western powers? The first part of the question was, what is the nature of this alliance among the Western powers? Is it economic or military or cultural? What is it? So let's take it step by step. This was actually proposed, and I've touched upon it, we'll revisit it a number of times in the course. that this was actually proposed by George H.W. Bush at the end of his presidency, along with Colin Powell, who was his appointed head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the military, and Theodore Shackley, who was the Associate Deputy Director for Operations, for covert operations for the CIA, that they actually drafted up this second draft of the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document in 1992. This was actually in May of 1992. They drafted it up saying, look, let's not go the way of the first draft and have the United States establish kind of unilateral full spectrum dominance over the entire world with its military on behalf of its own narrow self-interest as a nation state. Let's share the injustice, with these other Caucasian countries, and actually listed the countries so that we know exactly who they are. It's Canada, Mexico, and they actually pointed out governed by the PRI, which is the Castilian Spanish, not by the indigenous people. United Kingdom, France, Spain, Italy, and Germany, the new reunified Germany, now at that point in 1992. And as I pointed out, they even said, and Russia, now that Russia has spun off all of its ethnic provinces. I mean, that was the giveaway right there, in case one hadn't noticed what the Caucasian quality was of all of these countries that they were naming, that they actually exposed themselves in this classified document as to what the standards were, which now enabled them to bring Russia in, because they've spun off these non-Caucasian provinces. And so you can see that the nature of the alliance is racial. And so you say, well, is that cultural? Is it psychological? What is that? But then they went on to talk about how what they were proposing is that the United States be the one that uniquely provided all of the high-tech military equipment for this new Northern Industrial Alliance, so that it was clearly viewed as a military alliance, and that they would work through NATO, the North American Treaty Organization. And that what they were going to do then, and what you saw them doing, is immediately they started trying to recruit other Caucasian countries to come into NATO. That each of those, some of the provinces, some of the Caucasian provinces that spun themselves off, like Georgia and some of the others from Russia, from the Soviet Union, that they went right after them. And they started trying to solicit their joining the NATO. And so that they were trying to find other Caucasians to bring into other Caucasian nation states to bring into the alliance. And then what they were proposing is that the United States provide all the military equipment so that all of those countries chip in money into NATO, and then that money is used to pay American corporations to build these weapons, in that they have uniform rifles, they have uniform ammunition, that they all have the same caliber and they fire the same bullets. They have military equipment that all uses the same kind of parts, all of which are manufactured by the United States. And so that it was a huge profit-making operation on the part of the United States, but it was providing the military equipment to all of these different countries. So it was clearly a military alliance, but then they followed it up with the instigation of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT countries that were in Europe. And this became the origin of establishing the European Economic Community. And the European Economic Community started being projected onto them that they start thinking of themselves like the United States. So that each of the smaller nation states all through Europe viewed themselves as like a state, and that there would be like a supranational federalized republic in Europe that would be the European Union. Okay, and so that became cultural, it became economic, because then they had the euro, they generated their own currency, just like the federal government issued a unified currency for the United States government through the central bank, so that they were basically mimicking what the United States had done. And so they were trying to do this in Europe. So you had the military alliance that's going on through NATO. You had the cultural and political alliance that's going on through the establishment of the European Union. And you had an economic alliance because they established the common currency. Okay? So that it had all those things, but fundamentally it was racial, which is critical to keep in mind. Because you say, what's the point of this entire operation? You know, who are they? They're operating, they're bringing everybody all together in this alliance for what? Well, you can usually tell by who the members are. It's all the white people. So what are the white people organizing for? The white people are organizing because they're afraid of the Chinese. Okay? Because the Chinese have got like 3 billion people. And that they can mount a military, a conventional military of 1 billion people. You know, 1 billion people in the United States already dealt with that in the Korean War, on the Korean Peninsula. You know, when the United States invaded the Korean Peninsula and tried to seize the whole southern part of the Korean Peninsula, and the people in North Korea, the Koreans rebelled against it and attacked them, and the United States started pouring more and more and more military equipment in there to drive them back, and they drove them all the way up to the Yangtze River. And what happened then is the Chinese came in. The Chinese came in and kicked the shit out of the United States military. You know, at Incheon Reservoir and a whole bunch of other famous places, and just kicked the crap out of them because I mean they just overwhelmed them. They just threw hordes of military people at them and just mowed them down. And so the United States withdrew and begged off and pleaded for an armistice. And backed off and then drew the line that separates North and South Korea and basically set up shop in South Korea. And the Chinese accepted that temporarily, but not permanently. You can bet on that. You know? And so the real challenge here is that the Chinese have basically the same attitude toward themselves, is that they think they're in fact the superior race on the planet. And the Caucasians think that they're the supreme race on the planet, you know, and so that this leads to trouble because you can only have one big bull, you know, in the corral. And when they start thinking like that, they are in fact becoming mastered by the second paradigm that we'll talk about, the second paradigm worldview of a reactionary worldview against us and them, you know, yin and yang, black and white, good guys and bad guys. It drives them entirely. And you can see how that pervades our entire culture. I mean, right now, there are people crazy over watching these basketball games. You know, the red team and the blue team. And they give them a ball and they chase up and down the field. And you know, in the National Football League, you know, beating their brains in, you know, over a ball. You know, I mean, it's kind of nuts, actually, in a certain way. And so that they train everybody into developing a completely dialectical, you know, bipolar vision of reality. And the competition is the vehicle through which you basically demonstrate your expertise, you know, and your perfectibility of the species. And so this alliance that we're talking about is driven by all those factors: military, economic, cultural, but above all, racial. And fundamentally by the dialectic, which is a function of the lack of a fully evolved faculty of subtle discernment of the unitary nature of reality.
In Paradigm Politics, it said that Clinton's inconsistent worldview, it was like a mishmash of all the different things. It kind of made the conservatives change from the conservative worldview to the reactionary. How?
Well, it didn't make them do it. As you'll notice in Paradigm Politics, the section that I assigned, that the motive to establish this reactionary worldview happened instantaneously, right there on the morning of January, the first week of January of 1992. It wasn't instigated by the liberals doing anything. What really happened was that when the reactionaries came out and basically said, in short, let's return to the same exact organizing principle that we were governed by before 1917, during the entire robber baron era. Why don't we go right back to that now, because we've got no ultimate foe here to us. What happened is the Democrats, as I pointed out, and we'll talk about at some length in the course, is basically the Democrats lost their whole reason for being. The reasons that the Democrats had developed ever since 1917 was serving as an ameliorative to the otherwise over-crass capitalist, transnational imperialist drive on the part of the reactionaries, and so in the Republican Party. And so what they did is they for years, for like 75, almost 80 years, they had organized and saying, no, look, if you guys get everything you want, the people are going to be in the streets here. You know, if you're raping and pillaging and destroying everybody for the sake of your personal greed and avarice, you know, the people are going to revolt against you. And so here, listen to us. We're your best friends. You know, as Clinton said, or as Obama said to the bankers when he met with them, you know, the people are with the torches outside the castle gates here, and I'm your best friend. So let's figure out how to save capitalism here. You know, and so that's really what happened. The actual initial instigator was the reactionaries to establish that full spectrum dominance imperialist vision that they had from the 19th century. And the Democrats responded by saying, look, we no longer have any major threat challenging these people, so we don't have to be the soporific. You know, we don't have to be the ameliorating force here, and so they don't know what they're doing. They can't quite figure out what their ethos is, and they've been searching for it.
And it was because it happened so quickly that they couldn't figure out how to become actually liberal or progressive.
Yeah, they didn't know being liberal is actually the kind of worldview that allows them to kind of limit the forces of the reactionary worldview. But it's not effective in really neutralizing it. You have to get all the way over to the sixth paradigm worldview, the progressive worldview, to actually be able to counter the reactionary worldview, because they have a thoroughgoing, consistent alternative vision. The problem with the liberals is the liberals will agree that the principal engine driving all policy is economic profit, private economic profit. But what they want to do is they want to put some brakes on it so that it doesn't become excessive and so that it blows out the system, you know? And so that's the function that they have. Whereas the progressives are not wedded to the capitalist system as being the only mode of economic development and distribution of resources. You know, they're open to kind of multiple different modes of economic development, et cetera, and they're consciously so. And that's why the reactionaries in the authoritarians in the capitalist camp recognize them right away as the enemy, because they're actually belling the cat. You know, they're naming the beast. They're actually talking about capitalism. And the weird part of it is that capitalists always take the position that anybody who uses the word capitalist has to be a communist, or else they wouldn't recognize us. They wouldn't see what we really are, you know. And liberals will never use the word. They almost never use the word capitalism, you know, because they don't want to be branded as communists. So this is the plight that is presently facing the Democratic Party. And so that they rolled into place the Democratic Leadership Council that Richard Gebhardt sort of founded right immediately after the rise of the reactionaries at the end of the Cold War. And so they've been floundering around now for 13 years, you know, more than that now, 23 years, you know, trying to figure out the new ethos for the Democratic Party. And they haven't really succeeded yet.
Just because of all the problems that gerrymandering has created and Citizens United with giving like, corporations freedom of speech, and with super PACs, how can we go around that? Because as of right now, I just don't see like how we can push through it.
You have to mobilize massive grassroots support. That's ultimately our resort. You know, and everybody wants to do it an easier way. Everybody wants to say, wait a second. You know, isn't there some channel we can turn on and it'll tell us what to do? You know, isn't there a book that'll tell us what to do? You know, what do we do? You know, and so what I'm saying is we have to organize on a mass grassroots level. And the problem is, if you try to organize rooted in only a self-interest, utilitarian motive, if the mode of ethical reasoning that you're using behind your organizing is simply utilitarian, the people that you're trying to organize will quit as soon as they get what they want. You see, it's that old thing with the Nazis when they were taking over. That was it Niemöller, Reverend Niemöller said, you know, that when the Nazis came to get the communists, I didn't do anything because I wasn't a communist. And then they came to get the labor union people, or the socialists. So then they came to get just the socialists. I wasn't a socialist, so I didn't do anything. And then they came to get the labor union people, and I wasn't a labor union person, so I didn't do anything. And finally, they came to get me, and there wasn't anybody left to help. You know, and so if you appeal to people solely on the grounds of their own narrow personal self-interests, as soon as they get that met, they'll quit. And that's what the Constitution is all about. The Constitution is trying to get people to understand that the ethos of natural law is the basic underlying organizing principle that can protect our people. Okay? So you have to recognize that other people are of equal value to you. And that what's done to another person is just like having it done to you. People can recognize that with their own children, you know, or their grandchildren. Something is done to them, they have that visceral reaction that this is happening to us, and they'll respond. But if it's a neighbor down the street, or especially a neighbor in another state, or especially a neighbor in another country, and a neighbor in another race, you know, they don't give a shit. You know, that's why it requires what is referred to as conscientization, a raising of the consciousness of people. Because it's that energy field, that sensitive energy field that can reach out and have sympathetic resonance with other people's energy fields that bonds people into a unified system, and that people feel it as happening to themselves. Because there's only one self. And then people will do the right thing. And so that we recognize what the task is in front of us. And therefore we can recognize what the means are by means of which to effectuate it. But if you don't know what you're doing to begin with, you know, you're just off bumping into walls like the Democratic Party right now. You know, and so that's the challenge. Now, all of that having been said, you know, one sharp stick in one eye is better than two. And so, you know, having the Democratic Party have the White House and control the Senate is better than having the Republicans control all three of them. That's true. But I should tell you, in closing here on this question, that when Daniel Berrigan, I don't know if any of you are familiar with him, Father Daniel Berrigan is this really cool guy. He's a Jesuit priest that actually organized opposing the Vietnam War. And he led a whole bunch of people into the draft boards back when they would draft the young men. And he would lead them into the draft boards, and they would go in and they would take out all the files in the draft board, and they would bring them out into the back parking lot and pour their own blood on them and ruin the files so that they couldn't draft those guys. And Father Dan Berrigan and his brother Phil and Liz McAllister and Bill Davis and a number of other people, Father Davis, that were working with him, they were on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. I mean, they had all these priests and nuns on the 10 most wanted list, and they were chasing them all around the country. And they would pop up on Sunday mornings doing sermons in Catholic churches all around the country. And then the FBI would come flooding in the front door as they went out the back door, and they would leave. You know, so it was like this Robin Hood thing going on. And when I was with Dan, we were up in the Blue Ridge Mountains at a retreat for the Jesuit Volunteer Corps people. The young kids, when they get out of college, there's a thing called the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, which is like a Peace Corps. But they can go into it with the Jesuits, and then they go in different countries and around the country and around the United States doing, you know, bleeding heart stuff. And I shouldn't say it that way probably because they'll get mad. But you're doing really nice things for people and helping. And working on structure because of the Jesuit documents. So we were all up on this retreat with these young people, and one of the young women said to Dan Berrigan, she said, Father Berrigan, it's so confusing, you know, that we have this whole Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and half of the people are Republicans and half of them are Democrats, which wasn't exactly accurate. But she was saying, so what, can you tell us, what is the real difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party? And Dan said, well, he said, when people ask me about what the difference is between the Republican and Democratic Party, it always reminds me of when Ronald Reagan was still the governor in California. And Nancy Reagan used to go up and down the state of California telling everybody to just say no to marijuana. So she was at one of these many rallies and telling them just to say no to marijuana. And somebody stood up in the audience and said, Mrs. Reagan, how can you tell people to just say no to marijuana when you serve hard liquor, in the governor's mansion to people, and alcohol and liquor to them? And she said, well, if you were on a commercial airliner and the pilot was drunk on alcohol, at least you'd know it. So that's food for thought as to what he meant by that. Okay, so and that's the problem, is that the Democratic Party is doing mostly the same stuff to you the Republicans are, only you don't notice it, because they got a much better style and they're kind of cool and they pretend they're not doing it, But when push comes to pull, they end up voting with the Republicans to do all these horrible things. They voted to authorize W. Bush to go in and invade, Iraq, on the basis of no evidence whatsoever that there were any nuclear weapons there or weapons of mass destruction. And even after they discovered that there weren't any, they still stayed there and kept voting to do it. And even when they said, oh, Obama, Obama's going to stop this. Obama says, this is awful. We got to stop. We got to pull all of our troops out. He gets to be president. He leaves them right in there. And so people don't quite notice it. What's happening here, and so that it's really important. One of the things you need to really do as a result of this class, I hope, is to be cognizant of the fact that neither the Republican Party or the Democratic Party are your friends. They're not your friends, and they're basically the friends of the people who fund them and the people who pay them. Because 80% of them are lawyers, and so the question is, who's paying you? Who's your client? And that's who they serve, and that it's not serving you, and that they will be a little bit more responsive to the great unwashed getting in the streets and starting to rabble rouse and stuff, and they'll say, well, oh, here they come, and they'll start advocating that something be done to tamp down this type of public resistance because it looks bad. And so that they'll give these people to figure out what can we give them minimally that'll get them out of the streets, and that's all they'll give them. But they don't think in terms of giving them what is justly theirs, or sharing in any kind of responsible way about the value of the work that they perform, etc. I mean, we're still looking at women, women getting, like, they used to get 56 cents on the dollar for doing the exact same job the guys do, and yet the women make up 53% of the entire population, and both parties still refer to them as a minority group. I mean, what does that mean? What are we talking about here? So what I'm saying is that you need to be conscious of what's really going on here, and that this issue of thinking you can rely upon the Democratic Party to solve these problems is a total mirage. That isn't going to happen. They'll ameliorate them a little bit, well, not as much as they would used to, because they don't feel any particular motive to do it other than to get elected. And so that now if you have the same people paying them as they're paying the Republican Party, which they now do, they give money to the Democrats too, so they can have whoever wins is on their side, and the Democrats are standing right there with their hand out, taking the money. So we've got to figure out so one of the things that's going to be obvious during this course is that there has to be alternative political parties. There just has to be, and you got the Green Party, but the Green Party also doesn't know exactly what it's doing. They don't know what their worldview is. They know that trees are good, you know, and that they want to keep the ocean from being contaminated and save whales, all perfectly proper objectives. But, you know, where does that get you? I mean, what does that lead to? You know, what you know, and some of the people that are part of the Green Party coalition are a little bit more consciously opposed to transnational corporate capitalism, you know, but that they're only kind of a minor wing of them. They're kind of Marxist wing of those of the party. So that they really don't, they're part of the entire confusion of the liberal and progressive community in the aftermath of the Cold War. They still haven't figured out what their systematic ethos really is. And that's a problem. I thought you were going to. Okay, let me just everybody get to ask one of the questions, then we'll take multiple ones. Yes.
I had a question on constitutional law.
Yes.
So I have maybe kind of hard question because it's still being debated in the Supreme Court right now. But
Yep.
in this case, the Arizona legislature versus the Arizona redistricting committee.
Yes.
Are you familiar with this case law?
Yeah.
So it's like I think it's Waxman and Clement who are on both sides, but it's like I'm trying to kind of get your take on it. Like, they're kind of hung up on the framers' meaning of the word legislator in the elections clause of the Constitution.
Yeah.
And does a state's initiative referendum system constitute the legislator under the Constitution, or does like this initiative referendum system violate the guarantee clause of the Constitution? Like,
No, it's
a tough question.
no, it's not that tough. The people who are opposing it are the fat ass capitalists because they're afraid of the people. Okay, and you need to understand that the underlying the entire Constitution is the ultimate authority of the people, and the people have the right to mobilize. And in fact, one of the 3 essays that I've put up on the e-commons for you today is this one about metaphysics and epistemology. They talk specifically about this issue, and they point out in the second article as well is that underlying the entire concept of natural law is ultimately the right of the people to dissolve any particular legislature that is not meeting its needs. And there's this whole discussion about how out of tune with natural law do they have to be before the people are, it's really legitimate for the people to cast them aside and replace them. But that's a salient issue with regard to the natural law here. And the fact of the matter is that the legislature is supposed to be representative of the people. Okay, so their role is strictly representative. And if there's some other alternative mechanism that has been specifically authorized by the legislature itself, such as the referendum and stuff, or it's in the Constitution, and those who have ratified the Constitution have specifically put it in there, and that they've recognized, not given the authority to the people, but recognized the inherent authority of the people to mobilize and to pass a resolution or a referendum, and it's authorized by legislation, then there's no real, it's not an unconstitutional delegation of the legislative authority that has been given to them in their Constitution, because the authority of the legislature comes from the people anyhow. So only if you start getting confused and believe that somehow the legislature or the executive branch is invested with some kind of divine authority that is somehow being breached by having the people ourselves make policy, then you don't have the confusion. It's not hard. Now, given the fact that half the court is royalists, you know, they may find it more confusing, you know, but it's not a confusing constitutional question.
But this case would have profound impacts. If they did strike down this initiative, it would have profound impacts on California's own election process, because we had similar things going on here.
Oh, that's right. No, the initiative and referendum authority, and it's bizarre that they are pretending that it's such a complex question, because to the extent, as I said, to the extent to which the state legislature or the Constitution itself has explicitly provided for it, you know, they're not usurping any authority. It's been a delegation, but it's a delegation back to the people. It's not a delegation de novo to the people. It's just delegating back to them some of their inherent authority, which the people had delegated to them, but they'd conditioned it by having this thing in the Constitution of saying, you know, we're not giving you ultimate legislative authority. We're retaining the right to exercise legislative authority pursuant to a certain procedure. So it's not a hard question. Let me see. Oh, here we go. I want to get everybody to get one question before everybody gets two. Yes.
Sorry, this just seems like the underlying theme is capitalist or corporate capitalism is kind of the problem. But it would seem a little bit too easy to say just to get rid of capitalism, at least with the economics department, because I'm affiliated with the economics department.
Yeah.
It seems hard to find a system better than capitalism, but at the same time it's inherently super problematic.
Well, capitalism itself, I don't take issue with capitalism itself yet, but the corporate form of capitalism, where you have this peculiar business entity that can mobilize itself and garner unto itself the power and authority and legitimacy of individuals, asserting rights and all that, and in fact immunizing the owners in the management from liability, which everybody else is liable for whatever it is they do, is preposterous. And it's just this complete gift that they have given themselves by bribing the legislators into establishing this particular unique kind of business entity. So that's what has to be gotten rid of. You get rid of that kind of a business entity and say, look, whoops, I get shut off here. That it's perfectly, or did the batteries die? Probably. See, I've run out of the batteries. There has to be some standard of why I have to quit eventually. But the bottom line is look at people. Okay, all right. People who want to gather together in a group and have a business, that's terrific. And if they want to chip in money, share it in common to buy resources, whatever they need to do their business, that's terrific. And they can make whatever products they want to do. If the products start hurting people, people have a right to sue them, and get at them for whatever the damages were. And they cannot raise the argument that, well, look, we've only got $1 million here in the treasury of this particular company, and we did $5 million worth of damage, so screw you, We'll say, look, how much money have you got in the bank? Where's the money you got stashed away, to buy another El Dorado or something, and that's the solution to it. So entrepreneurial ambition, entrepreneurial zeal, creativity, all of that stuff, there's nothing wrong with that. And that's what they champion all the time whenever anybody starts talking to them. They start, jumping up and down about, invading my fundamental rights to free enterprise. Nobody's talking about that. We're talking about the form of the corporation, especially the transnational corporation that isn't even obliged to obey national rules, and sucking all the resources out of one place and transferring the money somewhere else. This is obvious. And so that's what we have to focus on. And that's why as an economics major, you ought to pound away on that particular problem and differentiate it from attacking capitalism. Because you don't have to do that. Because all of the good things that they say about capitalism, most of them are true. And they're very genuine and very real. And people respond to that in a very positive and concrete way. And people like it around the world, just like they like free speech. And like they like, freedom of association and freedom of the press. There are certain kind of inherent things that people find to be natural and normal. And this kind of entrepreneurial spirit and creative, spirit and entrepreneurial drive is very important as a motivation for people. So you don't let people buffalo you into thinking that, that we're beating up on capitalists or private business people or anything like that. It's just a very specific element of them that make up this maybe 1% to 2% of the people that own the stock in most of these major big corporations. Those are the people that are the bad guys here.
Plus, they can get liability insurance if they're that worried. My question had to do with the sources you were mentioning earlier. You were saying about how many American media outlets have to do that compromise when sharing information with the public, and you cited a few sources outside of the country that were
Al Jazeera and some of the others, yeah?
Actually, Al Jazeera was the question. There was a specific source because Al Jazeera America.
Yeah.
You didn't mention it specifically, but is it closer to Al Jazeera or is it closer to the American entities that have to make that heavier compromise?
Oh no, it's part of Al Jazeera, the international operation. It's part of the same structure. So and I think that the same the same conditions that we put on other corporations, we should put on some of those major media corporations. They don't have any kind of more immunity than any other business corporation would have, you know? And so that these people are responsible for things that they say and do, you know? Now, this whole issue of the availability of lawsuits against entities that are attempting to express opinions and other things, that I do not believe that any corporation, and this is where the Citizens United sort of got a lot of its kind of cachet, and that is by saying, look, you got the New York Times and the Washington Post, and they're asserting First Amendment rights. You know, I mean, how do they, as corporations, get First Amendment rights? They aren't people. And what they're actually saying is, well, since they have fundamental rights as a corporation, we ought to have fundamental rights too. But the reality is that the founders themselves specifically talked about freedom of the press and gave a specific right to, or acknowledged a specific right as flowing to these press companies, you know? And so that's a specific, unique authority that type of group has. And that general kind of fundamental right that they're engaged in exercising doesn't spill over onto all the rest of the corporations to have the right to religious beliefs and everything else.
They also implied it was equal, in which case money in our system is not a matter of equality.
Well, you need. I hear exactly where you're going. I'll tell what this. What you're saying is that the right to spend money, if you have lots of money, they're saying is just a simple exercise of free speech, and therefore money is speech. You know, and there's been a long series of cases in the court systems of the United States that point out that commercial speech is different than public policy speech or social speech, et cetera. When you're engaged in activity to promote your own commercial income and stuff like that, it's not the same. And that the court has different, and that there's a whole series of cases. That's what the court packing challenge was all about in 1934, when the Supreme Court was ruling repeatedly that the federal government had no right to try to regulate business. The contracts specifically, that the right to contract was a holy right, and that companies and corporations had that right to engage in free contract negotiations with every individual. And that way, because if they wanted to crush labor unions and stop them from being in there, they had a right to do that. Okay? And so those decisions that were being made, there was a whole range, REA Express, and all these cases that were decided. The Supreme Court was repeatedly ruling in favor of the corporations in 1933, 1934. And so what Franklin Roosevelt did is he threatened to get the legislature to raise the Congress to raise the number of justices on the Supreme Court from 9 to 12. And then he would appoint 3 new ones, and it would strike the balance in favor of the other way. And his mere threatening to do it caused the court to just overnight reverse itself and turn around and recognize the existence of this distinction between commercial speech and other speech. And so that's the one that they're ignoring right now in Citizens United, to pretend that the spending of money on the part of corporations is the same thing as speech. You know, that you can differentiate that commercial stuff. Now, it's a little more difficult with individuals. When you have an individual person who's not a corporation, and they want to spend money and give it to a person, that's a very, very challenging area that requires a lot more thought about what to do about that, because it doesn't immediately occur to me that a person who has acquired money lawfully through their entrepreneurial spirit, etc., isn't allowed to give money to pay for campaign contributions, like that. The real problem is in the issue of people being able to be paid to run for office. That's where the source of the problem is that, and that's why if you have public financing, so that and that's the cure to this thing, is that if in fact a person qualifies by having a petition circulated and a given number of people signed a petition saying we're interested in having her or him be a candidate for this particular office, then they in fact get to share in a certain amount of funds that are given to everybody who qualifies to be in the campaign. And that's the way to solve it, you know? And
Any private donations are a bribe.
that's right, they clearly are. I mean, nobody's giving them money just because they like them. They're giving them money because they want them to do something. And the whole concept of their being in the office is that they're not being paid by anybody to do anything. They're doing the thing they think is right. So that they ought to cut that off completely, in my opinion. But you have to have an alternative mechanism for funding people to run. Okay, everybody's got one question. Okay, we're on this. Oh, yeah, we'll go to the second round in a minute, but we've only got no minutes left. But we'll take one last one.
I mean, this is like a pretty big topic, so you can just go back. I'll ask you.
Okay, well, we'll deal with the big topic next time, okay? So listen, so on Tuesday morning, or Tuesday afternoon at 4 o'clock, we're in 114 Physical Sciences, okay? And we'll get to see our new room, and and say, talk to some of your other friends. Huh? Is it?
We have a class right before the lecture.
Oh.
4 o'clock lecture, and it's like right around the corner from where this is.
Oh, fabulous. So that's way cool. See, the gods are with us.
So one question, on Thursdays, or we're just gonna do this merry walk back?
Yeah. We'll walk together, and we can ask questions on the way. You know? Okay? All right. So there we go. Thank you, you guys.